Section 1. The show that rewrote the rules. There's a particular kind of cartoon that lives on the edge of things. It breathes there. It was built for that terrain, and it returns to it compulsively, like a person who keeps walking to the window even when there's nothing new to see. For more than 25 years, one animated series has made its permanent home right at the place where comedy stops being comfortable and starts becoming something else entirely. Something that makes people reach for their remote, open their laptop, file formal complaints with federal regulatory agencies, organize letter-writing campaigns to corporate sponsors, or simply sit in silence wondering whether they really just saw what they think they saw, and whether anyone else saw it too, and whether it was wrong for them to laugh. That show is Family Guy. Created by Seth MacFarlane and first broadcast on the 31st of January, 1999, Family Guy arrived into living rooms across America the night of Super Bowl 33. That's something worth sitting with for a moment. The Super Bowl, one of the most watched television events of the entire year. Tens of millions of people, families gathered together around a television, still buzzing from the game, settling in for whatever Fox had decided to put on next. And what Fox had decided to put on was a show featuring a murderous baby, a talking martini-drinking dog, and a father figure who had, in the very first episode, lost his job and tried to collect welfare by faking an injury. Roughly 22 million people watched that premiere. And Family Guy, from its very first moments on air, made clear that it had absolutely no interest in playing it safe. What followed over the next quarter century was one of the strangest, most turbulent, most debated runs in the history of American television. The show was canceled twice. It was revived twice. It attracted enough formal complaints to the Federal Communications Commission to fill several filing cabinets. It had episodes pulled from streaming services after real-world tragedies, drew uncomfortable parallels to animated jokes that had aired months before. It was attacked from the right by conservative watchdog groups who wanted it removed from the airwaves entirely. It was attacked from the left by advocacy organizations who said it caused real harm to real communities. It was attacked from the center by critics who said it was simply lazy, relying on shock value where cleverness used to live. And through all of it, it kept going. The story of Family Guy's controversies is not a simple story. It would be easy to reduce it to a list of bad jokes and offensive gags, to treat it as nothing more than a catalog of times a cartoon went too far. But that would miss something important. The controversies that follow in this video are not all the same kind of thing. Some of them represent moments where the show stumbled into territory it wasn't equipped to handle, where the writing room reached for something serious and came up with something harmful instead. Some represent moments where the real world moved in a direction that rendered an already dark joke into something genuinely disturbing. Some represent deliberate provocations, Seth MacFarlane and his team drawing a line in the sand and daring everyone around them to cross it first. And some represent something more complicated still. The question of what comedy is actually for and what it costs when a show decides that nothing is off limits. That question has followed Family Guy its entire life. And the answer the show has given over and over again across more than 2 decades is never quite the same twice. Before we get into all of that, let's take a breath and understand the terrain. Family Guy was not born in a vacuum. It arrived at a very specific moment in American television, at the tail end of the 1990s when animated comedies for adults were just beginning to find their footing. The Simpsons had been running since 1989 and had already established that an animated family sitcom could be smart, funny, and willing to push against the grain of network television expectations. South Park had launched in 1997 and was staking out even more aggressively transgressive territory, using crude animation and deliberately offensive content to make points about American culture that live-action shows would never have dared touch. Family Guy arrived looking, on the surface, like something that owed a significant debt to The Simpsons. A family, a father who was large and somewhat dim, a sensible, patient wife, 3 children with distinct personalities, a suburban home, a local bar where the men gathered. Critics in those early years were quick to note the structural similarities, and not always charitably. But beneath the surface similarities, Family Guy was doing something different. The cutaway gag, the technique by which a character would reference something, and the show would immediately cut to a visual non sequitur, gave the series a rhythm that was entirely its own. The comedy arrived from strange angles, in unexpected shapes, References to obscure films, television programs, and cultural moments that had nothing to do with the story at hand would burst into scenes like fireworks, burn bright for a few seconds, and disappear. It was a show that trusted its audience to keep up, or at least to enjoy the ride even when they couldn't. And the humor could be dark, darker than The Simpsons, darker than almost anything that had aired on network television before it. The baby wanted to kill his mother. The family dog drank martinis and had existential crises. The father committed casual acts of stupidity and occasional violence that would, in a live-action setting, be genuinely alarming. The show found comedy in places that other programs wouldn't go near, and it did so with a particular kind of gleeful confidence that suggested the people making it were fully aware of what they were doing and very much enjoying it. That confidence would, over the years, sometimes look like courage and sometimes look like recklessness. The difference between those two things is not always easy to identify in the moment. It becomes clearer with time and distance. Seth MacFarlane himself, now in his 50s and looking back at a body of work that spans more than 2 decades, has spoken publicly about the complicated feelings he now carries about some of what the show produced. In an interview with CBS Sunday Morning, he reflected on the philosophy he carried into the early years of Family Guy. His attitude, as he described it, was essentially that nothing mattered if something was funny. You did it, full stop. And then, as he put it, the older he got, he found himself looking back at episodes and recognizing that it was more complicated than that. That comedy and jokes do have an impact. That admission matters. It doesn't erase anything. It doesn't make the controversial moments less controversial. But it tells you something about the space that Family Guy has always occupied, a space where the rules of what was acceptable were being written in real time, where the people doing the writing were young and confident and sometimes wrong, and where the audience and the culture were processing all of it as it happened, often without a clear map. What you're going to hear in the hours that follow is the story of that processing. Each controversy, each banned episode, each regulatory complaint, each moment of genuine public outrage is a chapter in a larger story about what television can do, what comedy can do, and where the line between provocation and harm actually runs. That line, as it turns out, is different for everyone, and Family Guy spent 25 years testing it. So settle in, find your comfortable position, let the world outside grow quiet, and let's go back to the beginning of one of the most controversial runs in animated television history. We have a long way to go, and every step of it is worth taking slowly. If you're watching this right now, drop a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is there. And if you haven't already, hitting subscribe takes about 2 seconds, and it genuinely means the world. Now, let's get into it. Section 2, The Parents Television Council versus Seth MacFarlane, A War That Never Ended. If you wanted to understand the full scope of what Family Guy has meant to American cultural life, you could do worse than to study the relationship between the show and a nonprofit organization based in Los Angeles called the Parents Television Council. The PTC, as it's commonly known, was founded in 1995 with the mission of advocating for responsible entertainment that families could watch together without encountering content that its members considered harmful. Over the years, it became one of the most prolific sources of formal broadcast indecency complaints in the country, filing thousands of grievances with the Federal Communications Commission and regularly organizing its membership to do the same. Family Guy became, almost from its premiere, the PTC's single most prominent target. In May of 2000, barely a year after the show had premiered, the PTC launched a letter-writing campaign aimed directly at the Fox network. The goal was simple. They wanted Family Guy canceled. The campaign cited what the organization described as strong advertiser resistance and concerns about content inappropriate for family viewing. At the time, Fox had already shuffled the show around the schedule multiple times and was clearly uncertain about its future. The PTC's intervention seemed, to some observers, like another nail in the coffin. But the relationship between watchdog organizations and television networks is rarely as clean as that. Fox didn't cancel Family Guy in response to the PTC's campaign. The show continued, was eventually canceled for other reasons, came back, and went on to generate decades of additional content and controversy. The PTC, for its part, never stopped watching. Over the years that followed, the council would name Family Guy their worst primetime show for family viewing in 2000, 2005, and 2006. They would designate it their worst television show of the week on more than 40 separate occasions. They filed formal FCC indecency complaints against specific episodes. They wrote letters to the show's sponsors asking companies like the Wrigley Company and Burger King to pull their advertising, arguing that family-friendly products shouldn't be supporting family-unfriendly content. Seth MacFarlane's responses to all of this were characteristically not measured. In an interview with The Advocate magazine, MacFarlane was asked about the PTC's ongoing campaign against the show. His response became one of the most often quoted things he ever said about his critics. He described receiving hate mail from the organization as being comparable to getting hate mail from Hitler. He called the council's members literally terrible human beings. He said he had read their newsletter and visited their website and found them rotten to the core. He noted the irony of an organization that claimed to operate on Christian values, spending all of its time generating hatred toward people. And he concluded with a piece of profanity that left no ambiguity about how he felt about their efforts. This exchange captures something essential about the dynamic that defined Family Guy's public life for much of its run. The show did not retreat from controversy. It did not offer measured explanations or thoughtful defenses. It leaned into the conflict, used it as material, and treated its critics as part of the entertainment. MacFarlane, who voiced Peter Griffin, Brian Griffin, Stewie Griffin, and Glenn Quagmire, among others, was himself a performer who understood that nothing generates attention quite like a good fight. The PTC understood this too, of course. Every complaint they filed, every week they designated the show their worst program, every letter-writing campaign they organized functioned simultaneously as moral protest and as free publicity. The outrages fed each other. Family Guy's controversies drove PTC membership. PTC complaints drove Family Guy's notoriety. Both organizations benefited, in their different ways, from the ongoing hostility. But the PTC's complaints were not entirely without substance, and some of the episodes they targeted did represent moments where the show's approach to edgy comedy crossed into territory that many people found genuinely troubling. One of the earliest and most significant of these moments came in a cutaway gag from an episode called The Cleveland Loretta Quagmire. In this particular cutaway, which has nothing to do with the episode's main story, Peter Griffin and a barbershop quartet visit a man in his hospital bed. The man appears to be seriously ill, and the barbershop quartet proceeds to deliver the news of his diagnosis in song. The song is called You Have AIDS. They sing it cheerfully, in perfect four-part harmony, and it ends with the confirmation that the man has full-blown AIDS and that this information was delivered to him via barbershop quartet because someone, apparently Peter, felt this was appropriate. The moment is designed to generate a specific kind of uncomfortable laughter. The comedy comes from the collision between the cheerful, old-fashioned, wholesome format of the barbershop quartet and the devastating, very modern tragedy of a terminal AIDS diagnosis. It's the kind of joke that works, when it works, by making the audience laugh at something they know they probably shouldn't be laughing at. The shock of seeing something so serious delivered so inappropriately is itself the punchline. When the episode aired, several AIDS service organizations responded with immediate condemnation. They described the joke as irresponsible and disturbing. They argued that at a time when AIDS remained a stigmatized condition and its patients routinely faced discrimination, mockery, and inadequate care, a primetime television program choosing to make the diagnosis itself into a punchline was harmful rather than satirical. MacFarlane's defense was characteristically direct. He argued that the joke wasn't laughing at people with AIDS, it was laughing at Peter for being the kind of oblivious idiot who would think that a barbershop quartet was an appropriate way to deliver a terminal diagnosis. The target of the humor in his framing was not the sick man but the profound stupidity of the person who had arranged this terrible surprise. The joke was about Peter's failure of basic human understanding, not about the condition itself. This is a distinction that matters, and also a distinction that is genuinely difficult to hold on to when you're watching the scene. Because whatever the intended target of the humor, what the audience sees is a man in a hospital bed being serenaded with news of his impending death. The framing device of Peter is an idiot only does so much work when the image on screen is that particular image. This gap between intent and impact would become one of the defining tensions of Family Guy's entire run. MacFarlane and his writers often had genuine satirical targets in mind, jokes where the ridicule was meant to land on specific kinds of social behavior rather than on the communities affected by that behavior. But animation is a blunt instrument in some ways. When you draw something and put it on screen, the image exists independently of the intention behind it. Audiences respond to what they see, not to the theoretical framework the writers had in mind when they wrote it. The PTC filed formal FCC indecency complaints about multiple episodes over the years. Among the most significant of these was a complaint filed in 2009 about an episode called Brian and Stewie. In this episode, Brian and Stewie are locked overnight in a bank vault and spend the entire time in honest, vulnerable conversation. The FCC complaint centered on what the council described as excretory references. PTC President Tim Winter was quoted saying that it appeared McFarlane had carefully reviewed the legal definition of broadcast indecency and set out to violate it as literally as he could. That complaint was eventually rejected, as most FCC complaints against Family Guy were. The federal agency repeatedly found that the show's content, while unquestionably crude and often offensive, did not meet the legal standard for broadcast indecency. The standard requires content to be patently offensive by community norms, and the community of Family Guy viewers had, through years of viewing and cultural conversation, established their own norms around what the show was and what it did. Regulators, in the end, recognized that context matters, but that's not quite the same as saying the complaints were meaningless. Each complaint, each campaign, each letter-writing drive represented a group of people saying that a show had caused them real discomfort or real harm. That those feelings existed is worth acknowledging, even if the regulatory apparatus didn't ultimately support the outcomes those people wanted. The most striking moment in the long conflict between the PTC and Family Guy came not from any formal proceeding, but from a small human story that emerged in 2015. In that year, Tim Winter, the PTC's president, filed a complaint about a specific episode. And then, somehow, Winter and McFarlane ended up talking to each other. And somehow, those conversations led to them becoming something resembling friends, or at least mutual acquaintances with genuine respect for each other despite their fundamental disagreements about the show. This detail feels almost impossible. The man who called the PTC comparable to Hitler. The organization that had spent 15 years trying to get his show canceled. And they ended up having a real conversation. It didn't change either party's public position. The PTC continued to criticize the show. McFarlane continued to make it, but it suggests something about the human reality underneath these enormous cultural battles. The people fighting are rarely as simple as the positions they hold. The PTC's long campaign against Family Guy also tells a story about how watchdog organizations and entertainment culture interact over time. The PTC's concerns were, in part, about protecting children from content they considered harmful. But Family Guy was never intended for children. It aired in the early evening hours of prime time, which made it possible for younger viewers to encounter it. And its art style, colorful, cartoonish, featuring an animated nuclear family, could be mistaken at first glance for children's programming. The PTC wasn't entirely wrong that the scheduling created a potential for young audiences to encounter content that wasn't designed for them. But the solution they advocated for removing the show from the air entirely was a blunt instrument that many people found disproportionate. Family Guy's defenders pointed out that parents have tools to control what their children watch, that the existence of adult content on television doesn't require the elimination of that content, just thoughtful management by parents and caregivers. This argument, and the counter-argument it provoked, played out in op-ed pages, in congressional hearings, and in the quiet negotiations between Fox and its advertisers throughout the 2000s. And through all of it, Family Guy continued to make jokes that the PTC hated, and the PTC continued to hate them loudly. And somehow both of them kept going. The advertising pressure the PTC applied was probably more effective than the formal regulatory route. Several of the show's sponsors did pull advertising at various points in response to PTC pressure campaigns. McFarlane acknowledged this, describing it as an ongoing negotiation. When a sponsor leaves, it creates financial pressure on the network. When the network faces financial pressure, it has conversations with the production team about content. Those conversations don't always lead to changes, but they are part of the ecosystem within which the show exists. The relationship between advertiser sensitivity and creative freedom is one of the least glamorous but most consequential forces shaping what appears on television. Every episode of Family Guy that ever aired existed within a set of implicit negotiations about what would cause a sponsor to withdraw and what wouldn't. The show pushed against those boundaries constantly, sometimes successfully and sometimes not. What the PTC never quite achieved, despite its most determined efforts, was the cancellation of the show on moral grounds. Family Guy's cancellations in 2000 and 2002 were driven by ratings and scheduling problems, not by content complaints. The show's eventual return in 2005 happened because the audience demanded it. And the decades of operation that followed happened because the economics of the show continued to work, advertisers continued to come back after each controversy, and the audience continued to watch. That is, in some ways, the ultimate verdict on the PTC's campaign. The market spoke, the audience spoke, and what they said over and over again was that they wanted to keep watching. Whether that verdict is a celebration of creative freedom or a measurement of audience appetite for content that some people found harmful is a question worth sitting with in the quiet dark of wherever you're listening to this. From, it doesn't have a clean answer. Most things worth thinking about don't. Section 3, the banned episode. Partial terms of endearment. There is exactly one episode of Family Guy that has never been broadcast on American television. Not edited, not censored, not delayed, never broadcast at all, under any circumstances, by any American network that carries the show. That episode is the Season 8 installment called Partial Terms of Endearment, and the story of why it was banned and what happened to it afterward is one of the strangest chapters in the show's entire history. Let's set the scene properly. Family Guy had returned from its long cancellation in 2005 to enormous fanfare. Seasons 4 and 5 had performed well and continued the show's reputation as one of the most aggressively boundary-pushing programs on American television. By the time Season 8 was being developed in 2009 and 2010, the show was as established and confident as it had ever been. The writing room was operating with the knowledge that Fox had committed to ongoing production, that the audience was loyal, and that controversies were essentially part of the show's brand at this point. Into this environment, someone proposed an episode about abortion. The episode's plot follows Lois, Peter's wife, who reconnects with an old college friend named Naomi. Naomi and her husband Richard are unable to have children, and they ask Lois if she would consider being a surrogate mother for them. Lois agrees. She becomes pregnant. And then, while she is still carrying the child, Naomi and Richard are killed in a car accident. The episode then spends its second half exploring the question of what Lois should do with the pregnancy she undertook on behalf of people who are now gone. The episode ends with Lois choosing to have an abortion. Peter, who had been positioned throughout the episode as representing one set of views on the matter, comes around to supporting her decision. The final conversation between them is the episode's closing emotional beat. The subject matter was, by any measure, serious. Abortion has been one of the most politically and emotionally charged topics in American life for decades. It touches religious belief, bodily autonomy, the nature of life itself, the role of government, the meaning of consent, and the most private and painful experiences that people carry. To make it the subject of a Family Guy episode was either a bold choice or a catastrophic one, depending entirely on your perspective. Fox decided it was a catastrophic one. The network's decision to refuse broadcast was announced before Season 8 had even finished airing. The Family Guy team revealed it publicly at San Diego Comic-Con in 2009 during a panel where the show's producers and cast discussed the upcoming season. The announcement was made somewhat matter-of-factly, as if the network's refusal was not exactly a surprise, as if the writers had always known they were creating something that would test the boundaries of what Fox was willing to put on the air. Fox's reasoning was never made fully explicit in formal statements, but the understanding among those who followed the show was clear enough. Abortion was simply too politically volatile a subject for a primetime broadcast network. It didn't matter how the episode handled the topic, whether it was pro-choice, pro-life, or somewhere in between. The mere fact of an animated sitcom on a major network taking a definitive position on one of the most contested social questions in American life created a level of risk that Fox was not willing to accept. This was, in a sense, a different kind of controversy than the ones that generated FCC complaints and advertiser boycotts. The PTC's campaigns against Family Guy were about specific content that the council found indecent. Fox's decision regarding partial terms of endearment was not about indecency in the traditional sense. It was about political risk. The network had conservative viewers. It had advertisers who served those viewers. It operated in a regulatory and advertising environment where being seen to take a side on abortion could cost it real money and real audience. And so the episode simply didn't air. The irony of this outcome is not subtle. A show that had sung about AIDS in a barbershop quartet, that had featured a murderous baby, that had gone to Nazi Germany for laughs, that had generated more FCC complaints than almost any show in broadcast history. That show's episode about abortion was the thing that proved too much for the network. What this reveals is something important about how media institutions actually work. The things that generate the most noise from advocacy groups, the crude jokes, the religious irreverence, the sexual content can often be absorbed by a network willing to take some political heat and some advertiser pressure. But the things that touch the deepest political fault lines of American life, the ones where taking a side means alienating a very large and very motivated segment of the population, are the ones that institutions most reliably step back from. Abortion sits at that deepest level, always has. The episode did find its audience eventually. BBC Three in the United Kingdom broadcast it on the 20th of June 2010, where it aired in its usual primetime slot and drew an audience of roughly 1 million homes. Reviews in the UK were positive. Critics praised the episode for handling a difficult topic with the show's characteristic humor while also taking the emotional weight of the situation seriously. Several noted that it was, by Family Guy standards, a surprisingly thoughtful piece of television. In America, the episode was included in the Family Guy Season 8 DVD box set, which means American viewers could purchase and watch it, just not see it broadcast on television. This distinction matters less in an era of streaming and digital content, but in 2010, when DVDs were still a primary way audiences consumed premium and alternative content, the DVD release represented a meaningful avenue for the episode to reach viewers who wanted to see it. The episode is still not available on Hulu, which is the show's current streaming home in America. It remains, to this day, the only Family Guy episode that cannot be found on the platform. You can buy the DVD. You can find it in other ways in other places, but you cannot access it through the show's official American streaming platform. The ban, in this sense, has never fully lifted. The Family Guy team's reaction to the Fox ban was mixed. Seth MacFarlane and the producers had argued internally for the episode. They believed it was good television, that the subject matter was handled with appropriate care, and that an adult animated show had every right to engage with political realities. But they also understood Fox's position. MacFarlane has described his relationship with the network over the years as complicated, full of genuine respect alongside real creative frustration. The abortion episode was one of the clearest examples of where those two things ran directly into each other. What would partial terms of endearment have meant for Family Guy if it had aired? That's impossible to say with any certainty. It might have generated the single largest controversy in the show's history. It might have been praised as a genuine artistic achievement. It might have done both. The responses that came from the UK suggested that audiences were capable of engaging with the episode thoughtfully, of recognizing that Family Guy was doing something more complicated than simply making a crude joke about a politically charged subject. But American broadcast television, in 2010, was not quite ready for that particular experiment, and so the experiment never happened. The episode aired in Britain and sat in American DVD players and eventually found new life in digital distribution channels, but it never had the moment it might have had if it had played on a Sunday night on Fox, the way it was designed to. That absence is, in its own way, a kind of statement. The things a culture won't put on its television screens tell you something about that culture. American television banned an episode of its most provocative animated comedy because the episode tried to have an honest conversation about abortion. That tells you something about where American television was in 2010 and about the particular kind of risk that the most politically charged subjects in American life create for institutions that depend on advertising revenue and broad audience loyalty. It also tells you something about Family Guy, because the show that generated 188,000 FCC complaints about an orgy joke was also the show that had a serious, thoughtful episode about reproductive choice sitting in its library, waiting to be seen. Both things were real. Both things were true. And the complexity of that coexistence is part of what makes Family Guy's story genuinely interesting rather than simply scandalous. Section 4: Turban Cowboy and the Boston Marathon Catastrophe. There is a category of controversy that is different from all the others. It's the one where events in the real world collide with something that was made months or years before. And suddenly, a piece of entertainment that was designed to be harmless, or at least limited in its harm, becomes entangled with genuine tragedy in ways that nobody could have anticipated. Family Guy experienced this in the most direct and terrible way imaginable in April of 2013. The episode was called Turban Cowboy. It aired on the 17th of March 2013, and it was the 16th episode of the show's 11th season. The story follows Peter Griffin, who injures himself skydiving and ends up in a hospital where he befriends a man named Mahmoud, a Muslim. Their friendship develops over the episode, but it eventually takes a dark turn when Mahmoud is revealed to be a radical extremist planning a terrorist attack. The episode ends with Peter accidentally triggering the explosives the terrorists had planted on a bridge, blowing it up, and the family escaping. The episode had two elements that would later become deeply significant. The first was a cutaway gag in which Bob Costas, the longtime NBC sportscaster, interviews Peter about his performance in the Boston Marathon. The joke is that Peter has apparently won the race, and when Costas asks how he did it, Peter explains that he simply drove his car through the course, hitting runners as he went. The cutaway shows this happening, with animated figures flying through the air as Peter's car plows through the marathon. It's grim, but in the context of Family Guy's regular output, it was not an unusual kind of dark humor. The show had always been willing to generate laughs from animated violence. The second element was a scene in which Peter accidentally triggers explosives with his cell phone, causing a massive detonation on the bridge. The episode aired. It generated some critical attention. Most of it negative. Reviewers found the portrayal of the Muslim character reductive, and the episode's overall treatment of its subject matter clumsy. Kevin McFarland at the AV Club gave it a D, noting that it felt like something written in 2002 and left on the shelf for a decade, completely unaware of how uniformly Middle Eastern characters were being depicted as terrorists in entertainment. But as critical responses to Family Guy episodes go, this was not unusual. The show regularly generated mixed to negative reviews, and the episode moved through the news cycle without major incident. Then came the 15th of April, 2013. On that Monday, 2 pressure cooker bombs were detonated near the finish line of the actual Boston Marathon, the real one, the annual race that takes place in Boston. The explosions killed 3 people and injured hundreds of others. 17 people lost limbs. The attack was carried out by 2 brothers, Dzhokhar and Tamerlan Tsarnaev, who were later identified as having been motivated by radical Islamist ideology. Within hours of the bombing, someone the identity of this person was never definitively established created an edited video. This video took the 2 separate scenes from the Turban Cowboy episode, the marathon cutaway, and the bridge explosion, and combined them in such a way that they appeared to be a single connected sequence. In the edited version, Peter driving through marathon runners appeared to be immediately followed by the explosion. The implied narrative of the edit was that Family Guy had somehow depicted a bombing at the Boston Marathon. This video spread rapidly across the internet. It was picked up by, among others, Alex Jones, the conspiracy theorist, and InfoWars host, who used it to suggest that the episode had predicted or been used to plan the actual attack. Twitter and other platforms lit up with the edited video being shared and discussed. Some people who hadn't seen the episode, seeing only the edited clip, believed that Family Guy had actually broadcast an animated depiction of the Boston Marathon bombing. Seth MacFarlane's response was swift and unequivocal. He took to Twitter to call the edited video abhorrent, described the attack itself as a crime and a tragedy, and expressed clear support for the victims. The statement was direct and unambiguous. Fox moved quickly. Within a day of the bombing, the network pulled Turban Cowboy from Fox.com, from Hulu, and from Amazon's streaming platforms. A Fox spokesperson confirmed the removal and stated that the network had no immediate plans to broadcast the episode again. YouTube marked some of the edited clips as potentially offensive and removed many of them. The response across multiple platforms was an attempt to limit the reach of content that was circulating in a misleading form. It's worth pausing to consider exactly what had happened here, because the situation was genuinely complicated. The Turban Cowboy episode had not predicted the Boston Marathon bombing. The two scenes in question had no connection to each other in the original broadcast. The episode had been written and produced months before the attack. There was no meaningful parallel between the animated Peter Griffin driving through a cartoon marathon and two young men placing pressure cooker bombs at the finish line of a real one. What the situation demonstrated, with uncomfortable clarity, was how easily pieces of entertainment can be decontextualized in the digital age. The creation of the edited video was a deliberate act of manipulation. Whoever made it knew what they were doing, but the speed with which it spread reflected something real about how people process media in crisis moments. When something terrible happens, the human desire to find patterns, to locate warnings that were missed, to identify something that could have prevented the tragedy, creates enormous appetite for exactly this kind of apparent connection. The fact that it was false didn't make it less real as a cultural phenomenon. The video circulated widely enough that Fox felt compelled to act. The episode was gone from American streaming for years. MacFarlane was visibly distressed by the situation, not, it seemed, by the removal of the episode, which he appeared to support, but by the implication that he or his show had any connection to the actual bombing. He had written about and appeared in a piece of dark comedy that had nothing to do with the attack. The editing of that comedy into a false connection to a real tragedy was something he found genuinely offensive and hurtful. Eventually, in September of 2022, Turban Cowboy was returned to Hulu. 9 years had passed. The wound of the Boston Marathon attack, while not healed, had moved into history in the way that wounds do. The episode, whatever its creative flaws, was no longer a live flashpoint. It was an artifact of a specific cultural moment, a flawed piece of television that had been caught in a terrible coincidence of timing and had paid an unusually steep price for it. But the story of Turban Cowboy is worth remembering for reasons beyond the immediate controversy. It illustrates something that the creators of any fiction should probably hold in mind, even if they ultimately choose not to let it constrain their work. Art does not exist in isolation from the world around it. A joke that works in one context can become something entirely different when the context changes. The episode's original critics found it Islamophobic and reductive, and those criticisms stand independently of anything that happened in April 2013. The episode was not, by most measures, good television. It leaned into the most tired tropes about Muslim characters in post-September 11th American entertainment. It made a Muslim man a terrorist, presented this revelation as a twist, and resolved the plot with a bridge explosion. Whether the show owed the episode more thought and care, or whether it simply got unlucky with timing, is a question that doesn't have a single right answer. MacFarlane's tweet suggested he believed the timing was the primary issue, that the attack was a crime and a tragedy, and the parallel to his show was purely coincidental. Critics of the episode itself would argue that regardless of April 2013, the episode was already a problem before any bomb went off. Both things can be true at once. That is, in fact, one of the genuine lessons of the Turban Cowboy controversy. The most damaging outcomes don't always come from the most damaging intentions, and the world has a way of finding the tender spots in entertainment and pressing on them at the worst possible moments. The episode is back on Hulu now. You can watch it. Whether you should is a matter of personal judgment. What it is, in any case, is a window into a moment when a cartoon and a real-world tragedy intersected in a way that neither the makers of the cartoon nor the people living through the tragedy would ever have chosen, and into what happens to entertainment. When the world it mocks becomes the world it accidentally haunts. Section 5 Family Guy and 188,000 complaints. In the long and contentious relationship between Family Guy and the regulatory apparatus of American broadcast television, there is one number that stands above all others as a measure of just how much controversy a single episode could generate. That number is 188,368. That is the number of formal indecency complaints the Federal Communications Commission received following the original broadcast of the Season 7 episode called Family Guy. To put that number in some context, 188,368 complaints is an extraordinary figure. For comparison, the FCC typically receives fewer than 1,000 indecency complaints per month about all programming combined. The figure that prompted the FCC's famous attention to broadcast standards in the early 2000s, the Janet Jackson Super Bowl halftime incident of 2004, which became one of the defining regulatory flashpoints of that era, generated hundreds of thousands of complaints, but was coordinated across a much broader media ecosystem. A single episode of an animated comedy generating nearly 200,000 complaints is a genuinely remarkable thing. But there's a crucial detail to understand about that number. The vast majority of those complaints were organized by the Parents Television Council. The PTC had, in 2009, asked its members specifically to file complaints about Family Gay. This was not a spontaneous outpouring of viewer outrage. It was a coordinated campaign by an organization with a large and motivated membership base and a very specific bone to pick with this particular show. That doesn't make the complaints meaningless. They represented real people who had real objections to what they had seen. But it does complicate the picture considerably when you're trying to use complaint volume as a measure of genuine public sentiment. So what happened in Family Gay that generated this response? The episode's basic premise is this. Peter Griffin, on his way to buy groceries, spots a horse being sold at a roadside and impulsively purchases it. The horse turns out to be brain damaged, and in the chaos of trying to enter it in a race, the horse causes approximately $100,000 worth of damage before dying of a heart attack. To pay off this debt, Peter signs up to be a test subject for various pharmaceutical experiments. He gets injected with several experimental genes, one that gives him squirrel characteristics, one that temporarily transforms him into a Seth Rogen-type character, with Rogen himself providing the guest voice, and finally, the gene that drives the rest of the episode's plot, the so-called gay gene. After receiving this injection, Peter becomes gay. The episode then follows the consequences of this development for Peter and his family. He leaves Lois for a man named Scott. The family is thrown into disarray. Stewie, in a remarkably on-the-nose moment of meta-commentary, declares that homosexuality is wrong, which Brian pushes back on. Eventually, Stewie and Brian arrange to have Peter sent to what the episode calls Straight Camp, a conversion therapy parody that is played entirely for laughs, with the men there doing thoroughly inappropriate things with baseball bats when instructed to demonstrate heterosexuality. The episode ends with the effects of the gay gene wearing off in the middle of a gay orgy involving Peter and Scott and several other men. Peter runs home naked. Everything goes back to normal. Mort Goldman throws the dead horse through the Griffin's dining room wall. The PTC's complaint to the FCC specifically cited, among other things, an 11-way gay orgy and a suggestion that baby Stewie might have consumed a bowl of cereal contaminated with horse semen. PTC President Tim Winter called the episode deeply offensive and argued that it exemplified the kind of content that should not be broadcast on network television. McFarlane's response to the complaints was, characteristically, the one he gave when asked about the PTC generally. The analogy to Hitler's hate mail, the rotten-to-the-core characterization, and a concluding suggestion of what the PTC members could do with themselves. The FCC received the 188,368 complaints and ultimately took no action against Fox or the show. The regulatory agency declined to find the episode in violation of broadcast indecency standards, based on its interpretation of the legal framework that governs what can and cannot be broadcast over public airwaves. The law on broadcast indecency has specific requirements. Content must be, in legal terminology, patently offensive by community standards, and must include graphic sexual content, and the FCC's review of the episode concluded that it did not meet those standards. The LGBTQ community had a complicated relationship with Family Gay. On one level, the episode could be read as a satire of conversion therapy, presenting it as absurd and ineffective. The straight camp sequences were played entirely as parody, with the obvious implication that the enterprise was both ridiculous and harmful. In this reading, the episode was actually critical of anti-gay attitudes. Several gay rights organizations read it this way. On the other hand, the premise that gayness was caused by a genetic injection, a gene that someone could be dosed with accidentally and that would eventually wear off like a medication, was deeply problematic from a factual and political standpoint. The episode's comedy depended on treating homosexuality as a condition, something that happened to Peter and that his family needed to work around, rather than as an identity. The framing of gayness as temporary accident implicitly reinforced the idea that there is a normal state heterosexuality that people can and should return to, which is precisely the logic that conversion therapy advocates use. The show seemed to want to satirize homophobia while simultaneously building its comedy on premises that required homophobic logic to function. This is a tension that runs through a lot of Family Guy's treatment of LGBTQ themes, and Family Guy is the clearest example of it. The punchlines required you to accept that the situation a straight man accidentally becoming gay was inherently funny. The gay behavior Peter exhibited after his injection relied on stereotypes that many gay men found reductive and offensive. And yet the explicit moral of the episode, to the extent it had one, was that Lois and the family should accept Peter as he was, which is a fundamentally pro-acceptance message. Whether those tensions resolved into something meaningful or just canceled each other out is a question that different viewers answered differently. Reviews were mixed to negative, with most critics finding the episode more lazy than deliberately malicious. What Family Guy actually demonstrated, more than anything, was the peculiar position Family Guy occupied in American television culture. It was a show that could make a joke about a man accidentally becoming gay and play it for everything it was worth, with orgy sequences and conversion therapy, parody and horse semen jokes, and still have that episode represent, at its narrative core, a story about acceptance and love. It was also a show that could do all of that and generate nearly 200,000 formal regulatory complaints. Both things were equally real. The show contained multitudes, and the 188,368 complaints were both a testament to how deeply it had offended a specific community and a measure of how effectively one organization could mobilize that community when it chose to. The FCC's decision not to act was, in the end, the only possible outcome given the law as written. Broadcast indecency standards were designed to protect against a specific kind of harm, explicit sexual content accessible to children during hours when children might be watching. They were not designed to adjudicate questions about whether a show's premises were politically problematic, whether its stereotypes were harmful, or whether its comedy was lazy. Those are questions for audiences and critics, not for regulators. And audiences gave their verdict in the way audiences always do, by continuing to watch. Family Guy is part of the show's permanent canon. It airs in reruns. It streams on platforms where the show has a home. The 188,368 complaints are a historical footnote, a measure of a particular moment's particular outrage. The episode itself persists. That persistence is, in its way, the most honest statement about what Family Guy's controversies ultimately meant. They generated enormous noise. They consumed enormous energy. They involved regulatory agencies and advocacy organizations and public figures. And in almost every case, they changed nothing about the show's continued operation. The show endured. The jokes remained. The complaints dissolved into the archive of things that people got very angry about and then slowly forgot. Section 6, Quagmire's Dad and the Transgender Controversy. Season 8 of Family Guy brought with it an episode that, depending on who you ask, was either a genuine attempt at sympathetic representation that fell badly short, or a piece of television so insensitive that it actively contributed to harm against a vulnerable community. The episode was Quagmire's Dad. It aired on the 9th of May 2010, and it remains one of the most discussed and most debated episodes in the show's history. The episode begins with Brian Griffin departing for a seminar. While he's away, Glenn Quagmire, the show's resident womanizer, a man whose entire identity is built around sexual conquest, receives a visit from his father Dan. Dan Quagmire is a Navy lieutenant commander, a figure of authority and masculine competence, and in previous episodes, Quagmire has spoken of his father with enormous admiration. Dan arrives with news. He is a transgender woman, has decided to undergo gender-affirming surgery, and wants to begin living as Ida. The episode follows Quagmire's adjustment to this information and his family and friends' reactions to Ida. It also follows Brian, who returns from his seminar and, not knowing who Ida is, begins an evening with her that progresses into a sexual encounter. He later discovers that Ida is Quagmire's father, or, more precisely, the woman who was previously known as Quagmire's father, and his reaction forms the episode's most controversial sequence. That reaction is a sustained vomiting sequence. Brian, upon learning the truth, vomits for approximately 30 seconds of screen time. The animation depicts this with considerable emphasis on the act itself. Stewie watches this happen. It is played unambiguously for laughs. The GLAAD Gay and Lesbian Alliance Against Defamation responded to the episode with significant criticism. The organization highlighted several specific elements that it found problematic. The 30-second vomiting sequence was chief among them, as it presented a visceral, physical expression of revulsion toward a trans woman as comedy. The episode also depicted Brian conflating transgender identity with being a sex offender, stating that people like Ida are supposed to notify the neighborhood when they move in a line that the show seemed to intend as a statement about Brian's ignorance, but which played, in context, as unchallenged characterization. MacFarlane addressed the controversy in a September 2010 interview where he expressed genuine surprise at the negative reaction. He argued that the episode was a sympathetic portrayal of a transgender character and defended Brian's vomiting reaction as a reflection of Brian being a heterosexual man who had unwittingly had a sexual encounter with someone who had previously presented as male. His framing of this was that the reaction was natural and not indicative of a negative attitude toward trans people generally. The defense did not satisfy many critics. The core problem was not that Brian had a reaction. It was that the show had chosen to depict that reaction as 30 seconds of graphic vomiting, animated with deliberate comedic emphasis, and played for laughs in a way that made the trans woman the punchline, rather than the ignorance. The audience at home was invited to laugh at Brian's disgust. Whether that disgust was presented as understandable or not, the laughter it generated came at Ida's expense. There were aspects of the episode that were, by the standards of 2010 cable and broadcast television, surprisingly humanizing toward Ida. Quagmire's eventual acceptance of his parent, not without difficulty, but genuinely was portrayed with some emotional warmth. The voice performance of Ida was handled with a degree of dignity, and the episode acknowledged, at least implicitly, the reality of what it means to come out as trans and the courage it requires. But these elements existed alongside significant problems. The portrayal of the surgery itself was medically absurd. Ida goes in for the procedure and walks out immediately afterward as a fully transitioned woman, with no recovery time and no complexity. This depiction, while comedically convenient, reinforced the idea that gender transition is a simple physical process, rather than the long, complicated, deeply personal experience it actually is. It also implied, through the speed of the transformation, that the real identity was the physical one achieved through surgery, rather than the gender identity that trans people hold throughout their lives regardless of what stage of transition they're in. The episode also featured a final scene in which Quagmire beats Brian severely, physically assaulting him for having slept with Ida. The show presents this as a justified response, but the logic of the justification is troubling. Brian did nothing wrong by trans people's standards. He had a consensual encounter with Ida, who was an adult. The fact that Ida had previously presented as Dan Quagmire is not a justification for violence in any meaningful ethical framework. But the episode played the beating as a punchline, as a kind of cosmic comeuppance for Brian, which was, in 2010 and remains now, a very strange moral to draw from a story that was ostensibly about acceptance. Emily van der Werf, writing for The AV Club, describes some of the scenes as surprisingly well done, while noting that the moments of mockery were too mean-spirited for the show's toolkit at its best. This split assessment captures the episode accurately. It was doing some things thoughtfully and some things very poorly, and the poorly done things were visible enough and damaging enough that they overshadowed the thoughtful parts for many viewers. The year 2010 sits in an interesting place in the history of LGBTQ representation on American television. The argument that representation in entertainment was getting better was true, but it was getting better unevenly, and transgender people were, in 2010, significantly less visible and significantly more misunderstood in mainstream culture than gay and lesbian people had become. Family Guy was, for millions of people, one of their primary sources of cultural information about transgender identity, and what it told them, through Brian's vomiting and the other elements of Quagmire's dad, was not always helpful. This is the specific kind of harm that representation controversies address, and it's worth being precise about it. The argument isn't simply that the episode was offensive, which is a matter of taste. The argument is that in a culture where many people's understanding of transgender identity is formed in part by what they see in popular entertainment, an episode like this one, with its medically absurd depiction of transition and its graphic disgust response, contributes to a set of misconceptions that trans people then have to live with in their real interactions with other people. The episode's reach across millions of viewers meant that its specific errors and its specific tone had a scale of impact that an individual person's ignorance does not. MacFarlane has not, to the best of available public record, offered a more nuanced reflection on this episode than his original defense. The show has returned to Ida as a character in later seasons, treating her with somewhat more consistency and somewhat less sensationalism. But Quagmire's dad remains in the catalog as the most significant engagement the show has had with transgender identity, and its legacy is mixed at best. The episode is, in the end, a document of a specific moment in a specific cultural conversation. In 2010, American entertainment was beginning to grapple seriously with transgender representation for the first time. Family Guy's engagement with that conversation was clumsy, sometimes harmful, and also, in its messy way, a reflection of where the broader culture was rather than some aberration from it. That doesn't excuse the specific problems, but it does provide context for understanding how those problems came to be. Section 7, Road to Germany, the Holocaust episode. There are subjects that comedy has long engaged with that remain, by almost any measure, the most difficult terrain imaginable. The Holocaust, the systematic murder of approximately 6 million Jewish people and millions of others by the Nazi regime during the Second World War, is perhaps the most profound of these. It was an event of such scale, such deliberate evil, and such lasting trauma that the question of whether it can be the subject of comedy is one that artists and ethicists have grappled with since the earliest post-war years. Family Guy entered this terrain in a Season 7 episode called Road to Germany, which aired on the 19th of October 2008. The Road to episodes were among the most beloved entries in the show's catalog. Beginning with Road to Rhode Island in Season 2, these episodes put Brian and Stewie together on an adventure format, loosely parodying the classic road to comedy films that starred Bing Crosby, Bob Hope, and Dorothy Lamour in the 1940s and 1950s. The Road to episodes worked because the Brian and Stewie dynamic was the show's strongest relationship. The cynical, intellectual dog and the genius baby made for a genuinely funny odd couple, and the adventure format gave the writers license to take them to unusual settings. Road to Germany took them to Nazi-occupied Poland. The setup involves Mort Goldman, the show's pharmacist and one of its recurring Jewish characters, accidentally activating Stewie's time machine, which he mistakes for a portable toilet. Brian and Stewie use the device to follow Mort and discover that he has materialized in Warsaw, Poland, on the 1st of September 1939, the very morning that Germany invaded Poland, setting World War II in motion. Mort, who is Jewish, is in Nazi Germany, and Brian and Stewie have to get him out. What follows is an adventure episode that sends the trio through occupied Europe, involving an elaborate escape from Nazi soldiers, a trip to England to recharge the time machine, a bombing run over Berlin, where Stewie disguises himself as Hitler to obtain nuclear material, and a sequence involving submarines. The episode was written by Patrick Megan. Before broadcast, Jewish executive producer David A. Goodman read the script aloud to the production team and, according to accounts of the meeting, said aloud that he expected to be thrown out of his synagogue for it. This detail is telling. It suggests that the people making the episode knew they were on difficult ground, and that the Jewish voices in the room were fully aware of the sensitivities involved. The episode received relatively positive reviews, which placed it in a distinct category from many of the other controversies in this video. Road to Germany was not universally condemned. It was, in fact, nominated for a Primetime Emmy Award for Outstanding Comedy Series in 2009, along with 2 other Season 7 episodes. Many critics found it genuinely funny, with the adventure format working well and the character dynamics between Brian, Stewie, and Mort being among the highlights. But the controversy it generated was real, even if muted compared to other episodes. The central question was straightforward. Is the Holocaust an appropriate subject for comedy? And if it can be, what kind of comedy is appropriate? The Road to Germany episode made a specific choice about how to handle the material. It did not shy away from the horror of the historical moment. The opening sequence, which depicts Brian, Stewie, and Mort, materializing in Warsaw as German Stuka bombers begin their attack, was praised by several IMDb reviewers for its unexpected emotional weight. One review described it as the most effective dramatic depiction of the opening of the Holocaust they had encountered, noting that a few images and a handful of words had conveyed the enormity of the crime with remarkable economy. The festive atmosphere of a Jewish wedding in the synagogue, immediately interrupted by the sound of German bombers, and the dawning realization of what is about to happen to everyone in that room, that sequence was not a joke. It was a genuine moment of historical horror, rendered in animation. The episode balanced this with the comedic premise of Mort being exactly the most inconveniently placed person in all of history for a time travel emergency. A hypochondriac Jewish pharmacist in Nazi-occupied Europe. The comedy came partly from the situation and partly from Mort's very specific personality, his anxiety, his complaining, his tendency to catastrophize playing out against a setting where catastrophizing was completely warranted. There's a tradition in Jewish comedy that treats historical suffering as territory for reclamation through laughter. The idea that surviving and even finding humor in the worst things that history has done to a people is an act of defiance rather than disrespect is a perspective that has informed Jewish comedic culture for generations. Whether Road to Germany belongs in that tradition or whether it was appropriating that tradition to serve a mainstream animated comedy's need for a novel setting is a question that different viewers answered differently. The Parents Television Council did not name Road to Germany its worst show of the week, an unusual absence given their typical engagement with Family Guy content. However, they did reference the episode in a negative review of the following installment, which they felt showed additional violence toward Jewish characters. The combined effect of the two episodes, in the PTC's analysis, was troubling. Jewish advocacy organizations had varied responses. Some found the episode offensive for its treatment of a subject they considered too sacred for this kind of comedy. Others found it within the range of acceptable dark humor and noted that the episode at least depicted the historical reality of the Holocaust, rather than minimizing or distorting it. What Road to Germany ultimately represents is one of the rare cases where Family Guy's controversy was genuinely complex and not reducible to a simple judgment. The episode was, by many measures, well-crafted. The adventure structure worked, the character dynamics were strong, and the emotional undertone of the historical setting was acknowledged rather than dismissed. The question of whether it should have been made at all, and whether its comedy came at a cost that wasn't worth paying, is one that reasonable people can answer differently. The broader lesson might be that the question of what comedy can engage with is never about subject matter alone. It's about how. The difference between comedy that honors the gravity of its subject while finding genuine humor in the human experience of navigating it, and comedy that uses historical suffering as a backdrop for cheap laughs, is real and meaningful. Road to Germany, for most of its runtime, was trying to do the former. Whether it fully succeeded is a judgment call. What it demonstrates is that Family Guy was occasionally capable of attempting something more than shock value, even in its most controversial territory. Section 8. Screams of Silence and Domestic Violence. The episode that many critics and fans point to as the single most poorly judged piece of television in Family Guy's entire run is not a banned episode. It was not pulled from streaming services after a real-world tragedy. It did not generate the largest number of regulatory complaints in the show's history. It aired in full, at its scheduled time, on the 30th of October 2011, and it remains part of the show's permanent catalog. It is called Screams of Silence, the story of Brenda Q. To understand why this episode is so often cited as the show going too far, you need to understand what it was trying to do. The concept was, in some ways, ambitious. Family Guy was attempting a serious, dramatic episode about domestic violence, a subject that affects roughly 1 in 4 women in the United States at some point in their lifetimes, that kills approximately 3 women per day in America, and that is characterized by complex psychological dynamics that are genuinely difficult to understand from the outside. The episode follows Quagmire's sister Brenda, who is in a relationship with a violent man named Jeff Fiekelman. The episode depicts the physical and psychological abuse Jeff inflicts on Brenda in unusual detail for a comedy series. There are visible bruises. There is explicit depiction of manipulation and control. There is a sequence in which Brenda defends Jeff to Lois over lunch, covering the bruise on her eye with sunglasses and making excuses for behavior that Lois can see clearly is dangerous. The episode's plot is driven by Quagmire's determination to rescue Brenda from Jeff. He and Peter and Joe ultimately decide that the only solution is to kill Jeff, on the grounds that men who behave this way never change. They lure Jeff into the woods on a hunting trip, intending to make it look like an accident. Jeff anticipates their plan, takes Quagmire hostage at gunpoint, and nearly strangles him to death. Quagmire survives and runs Jeff over with a car, killing him. The episode ends with Brenda receiving a fake note claiming that Jeff has left her, which she believes, and she grieves without knowing that her brother murdered her abuser to protect her. The episode generated immediate and significant controversy. A.J. Hammer, the television personality, described it as a depressing half-hour of television that shocked him. Wendy Walsh, a television host and psychologist, was asked to comment and expressed concern about the episode's central framing. Walsh pointed out that the episode presented Brenda as simply too stupid to leave her relationship, which, Walsh noted, reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of how domestic violence actually works. This criticism strikes at the heart of what the episode got wrong. Domestic violence is not simply a situation in which someone is staying in a bad relationship because they can't figure out that it's bad. The psychological dynamics of abusive relationships are complex and deeply studied. Victims of domestic violence stay in abusive relationships for an enormous range of reasons. Fear of escalating violence if they leave, financial dependence on the abuser, isolation from support networks that the abuser has engineered, traumatic bonding, the presence of children, housing insecurity, the reality that the period immediately after leaving is statistically the most dangerous time for abuse victims. The average victim leaves and returns to an abusive relationship 7 times before leaving for good. Brenda, in the episode, is presented as making excuses for Jeff's behavior and refusing to acknowledge the reality of what is happening to her. The intervention scene has Quagmire delivering a speech that is meant to be emotionally powerful, and the voice acting from McFarlane does convey genuine distress. But the content of the speech includes him calling Brenda a cowardly punching bag who has stopped being a woman by choosing to stay with Jeff. That's the line that many critics found genuinely damaging. The implication that staying in an abusive relationship means you have failed to be a real woman, that victimhood is a form of moral failure, is not only false, but is precisely the kind of thinking that isolates abuse victims. Further, when society tells people that they should simply leave, that staying is weakness or stupidity or cowardice, it adds shame and self-blame to an experience that is already overwhelming. People who have tried to leave and been dragged back, or who are too frightened to leave, or who are navigating real practical barriers to leaving, are harmed by the narrative that their continued presence in the relationship is their own failure. The episode's resolution compounds the problem. After Jeff is killed, Brenda is deceived about his fate. She never knows what happened. She grieves the man who beat her. The episode seems to want this to be bittersweet. She's safe, even if she doesn't know why. But the framing removes Brenda entirely from any agency in her own story. She didn't rescue herself. She didn't get the information she needed to make her own choice. She was handled by the men in her life, protected through violence, and then lied to, and the narrative presents this as the best possible outcome. For women and advocates who work in domestic violence support, this storyline was deeply troubling. Not because Family Guy had engaged with domestic violence as a subject, but because of the specific way it engaged with it. The episode told its audience that victims are there because they're too weak or cowardly to leave, that the right response to an abuser is murder, and that the victim's own understanding of her situation is ultimately irrelevant. The show's attempt to handle a serious subject without the tools to handle it properly resulted in something that communicated harmful misinformation about a topic that has real stakes for real people. What makes this episode stand out from others in the controversy catalog is that it was trying to be serious. It wasn't a dark cutaway joke. It wasn't an off-color reference in the middle of an unrelated story. It was a full half-hour episode dedicated to the subject of domestic violence, making a sustained argument about that subject and making it poorly. The show's usual defense that the offensive content is satirizing something rather than endorsing it doesn't really apply here. The episode wasn't satirizing domestic violence. It was trying to tell a story about it, and the story it told was wrong in ways that mattered. Section 9 Religion in the Crosshairs, Jesus, God, and the Christian Backlash. Seth MacFarlane has been publicly, explicitly, and enthusiastically atheist for his entire career. He has discussed this in interviews, incorporated it into his work, and made no effort to moderate his views on the subject in public contexts. This is, of course, his right. And his show, Family Guy, has consistently reflected his perspective on religious faith, particularly Christianity, in ways that have generated sustained and significant backlash from Christian communities and organizations for more than 2 decades. The history of Family Guy's treatment of religion is long and varied. The show has targeted virtually every major religious tradition at various points, but Christianity and within Christianity, Catholicism specifically has been the most frequent and most intensely engaged subject. The reasons for this are not hard to identify. MacFarlane grew up in Kent, Connecticut, in a cultural context where Christianity was the dominant religious tradition. His rejection of religious faith was a rejection of something he knew from the inside, and that personal familiarity gave the show's religious satire a specific texture. The Parents Television Council documented Family Guy's treatment of religion with considerable thoroughness over the years. Their 2006 report on entertainment television and religion cited the show's mockery of God as a constant. The report noted that God had been depicted in various episodes as a dirty old man, as a figure who engages in morally questionable behavior, and as generally disconnected from the reverence that Christians associate with the divine. The PTC characterized these depictions as anti-Christian and argued that no other religious tradition was treated with comparable irreverence. One of the show's most prolific recurring religious elements is the character of Jesus Christ himself, who has appeared in multiple Family Guy episodes as a character with speaking lines, his own personality, and a range of behaviors that have consistently outraged Christian viewers. The Season 7 episode I Dream of Jesus, which aired in October of 2008, introduced a version of the storyline that would later be developed further. But it was the Season 13 Christmas episode, The 2000-Year-Old Virgin, which aired in December of 2014, that generated the most intense Christian backlash. The episode's premise takes the concept of the 2005 film, The 40-Year-Old Virgin, and transplants it to the religious context. Peter Griffin, at a shopping mall, runs into Jesus Christ, who is depicted as depressed, lonely, and living in Stowe, Massachusetts, having seemingly given up on his divine purpose. The Griffins learn that Jesus is, as the episode's title suggests, a virgin. Peter and his friends decide to help Jesus lose his virginity, setting him up on dates and eventually attempting to arrange an encounter between Jesus and Lois. The episode then reveals, in its third-act twist, that Jesus is actually not a virgin. He has been pretending to be one for 2,000 years because it causes husbands to let him sleep with their wives. He performs this trick every Christmas. The episode ends with Jesus making a transparently false excuse about the whole thing having been a test of temptation, which Peter and Lois accept, and then Jesus breaking the fourth wall to announce that, since he's not real anyway, Merry Christmas to everyone. The Christian response was swift and extensive. Christian News Network published a detailed critique of the episode, calling it blasphemous and describing it as 30 minutes of a ticked-off anti-Christian making sure the world understands that he hates Jesus. IMDb reviews from Christian viewers described the episode as genuinely sickening, and some stated it was the first time they had stopped watching a Family Guy episode partway through. Organizations called for the episode to be pulled, though Fox ultimately aired it in full. MacFarlane's acknowledgement of the controversy was, in the episode itself, made explicit. At one point, Peter breaks the fourth wall to acknowledge that the episode would be found offensive by Christians, and the script includes a fictional address to which complaints can be sent. The joke was the show winking at its own provocation. Whether that wink made the provocation more acceptable or less acceptable was, predictably, a matter of perspective. The thing that makes the religious controversy around Family Guy particularly interesting is the consistency of the show's position over many years. This was not a single misjudgment or a one-time provocation. The show returned to religious satire and to the specific target of Christianity, with regularity across every season. The God character appeared in dozens of episodes. Jesus returned multiple times. Catholic rituals, Protestant worship, evangelical culture, and institutional religious authority were all subjects for comedy in various episodes. For the PTC and for Christian critics of the show, this consistency was part of what made the problem so serious. It wasn't that the show had stumbled into accidental offense. It was that the mockery was deliberate, sustained, and in their reading motivated by something more than simple satire. The founder of the PTC, Brent Bozell, accused MacFarlane of running an anti-Christian enterprise and of having particular contempt for Catholic and evangelical Christianity. MacFarlane's position, as articulated in interviews, was that the show was an equal opportunity offender. Every tradition, every community, every institution got satirized. The show was not singling out Christianity, it was applying the same irreverent lens to everything. His defense was that good satire does not exempt anything from scrutiny. This defense was partially convincing to people who found the show funny and partially unconvincing to people who were on the receiving end of the satire. The history of comedy is full of arguments about whether an equal opportunity offender is actually treating everyone equally, or whether targeting everyone equally actually means something different depending on the power dynamics of the communities being targeted. A joke about a dominant cultural institution lands differently than a joke about a marginalized community, even if the technical form of the two jokes is identical. Christianity, in the American context, is not a marginalized community. It is the majority faith tradition of the country, with enormous cultural, political, and institutional power. Making fun of Christianity is, in this sense, a very different kind of creative act than making fun of a community that faces discrimination and social pressure. MacFarlane's atheism, in the American cultural context, is itself a minority position, but the Christianity he's critiquing is the dominant faith, not a persecuted one. This distinction doesn't mean religious satire is wrong. It means the context of the satire matters. The PTC's claim that no other religious tradition was treated with comparable irreverence was not entirely accurate. The show had satirized Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, and other traditions in various episodes. But the sustained intensity of the Christian satire was, by any measure, greater than its engagement with other faiths. Whether that disparity reflected genuine artistic intent, the demographics of the show's writers, or MacFarlane's personal history with Christianity, is something only the people in that writer's room could say with certainty. What it produced, over 25 years, was one of the longest-running and most sustained critiques of Christianity in the history of American mainstream entertainment. And it also produced, in response, one of the most sustained campaigns of formal protest by Christian advocacy organizations against any single television program in that same history. The two sides continued their standoff for the entirety of the show's run, with neither making significant progress toward the other's position. MacFarlane continued to make the jokes. The PTC continued to object to them. The FCC continued to decline to act. And the audience continued to watch. The result, viewed from a distance, looks less like a cultural crisis and more like the normal friction of a pluralistic society working out what kind of speech and expression is acceptable in a shared public space. It was noisy. It was sometimes genuinely hurtful to people who found the show's treatment of their faith offensive, and it never quite resolved into anything definitive. That's probably about what you should expect from a fight between a brilliant, confrontational atheist showrunner and a powerful religious advocacy organization. Neither side was going to convince the other. Both sides had legitimate concerns and positions worth understanding. And the audience, sitting in the middle, got to watch a very long argument play out in real time through the medium of an animated cartoon about a family in Rhode Island. Section 10 Race, Real-Life Events, and the Trayvon Martin episode. When a piece of popular entertainment decides to engage with a real-world tragedy, while that tragedy is still fresh in the public consciousness, while the wounds are still open, while the debates are still raging, while people who lost something are still grieving, it takes on a specific kind of responsibility that goes beyond the usual considerations of taste and craft. Family Guy's engagement with the Trayvon Martin case was, by most measures, not a success in navigating that responsibility. The episode is called A Shot in the Dark. It aired on the 13th of December 2015 as the 9th installment of the 14th season. Its internal production title, which was eventually changed before broadcast, was Stand Your Brown, a pun on the Stand Your Ground law. that George Zimmerman invoked in his defense after shooting Trayvon Martin, and on the last name of Cleveland Brown, the show's primary black character. The Trayvon Martin case had reached its most painful public moments in 2012 and 2013. Trayvon Martin was a 17-year-old black boy, shot and killed by George Zimmerman while walking back from a convenience store in Sanford, Florida. Zimmerman was a neighborhood watch volunteer who had followed Martin despite being told by police dispatch not to do so. The subsequent investigation, trial, and acquittal of Zimmerman became a national flashpoint on questions of race, self-defense law, institutional bias, and the specific dangers that young black men face in American society. Family Guy's version of this story has Peter Griffin forming a neighborhood watch group after his couch is stolen from his front lawn and eventually, while on patrol at night, shooting a figure he sees trying to enter Cleveland's house through a window. The figure turns out to be Cleveland's son, Cleveland Brown Jr., who was entering through the window because Cleveland had made a rule that using the window was more energy efficient than the door. Peter is subsequently arrested and charged with a hate crime. Cleveland and his family turn against Peter, accusing him of racism. The episode then follows the courtroom drama and the collapse of the friendship between Peter and Cleveland. The episode was delayed twice before it finally aired. It had been scheduled for the 15th of November 2015, but Fox replaced it with a different episode, following the November 2015 Paris terrorist attacks. It was then rescheduled for the 6th of December 2015, but replaced again following the San Bernardino mass shooting. This double delay is itself significant two consecutive decisions that the timing was wrong to broadcast an episode about racial violence in America, both times because real racial and political violence had just occurred. When it finally aired, the episode received criticism from multiple directions. Critics argued that trivializing one of the most painful ongoing public conversations in American life about race, policing, and the specific dangers facing black Americans through the framework of a Peter Griffin mistake was a fundamental category error. The Trayvon Martin case was about a real boy who was killed. The systematic undervaluing of black lives was not a punchline. Using it as a comedic premise, even a satirical one, caused harm by reducing the stakes of the conversation. The episode's defenders argued that it was actually making a sophisticated satirical point about how accusations of racism function in public discourse, and about how Cleveland's certainty that Peter acted out of racial bias was ultimately incorrect. In this reading, the episode was interrogating the way racial narratives sometimes collapse the complexity of individual situations. The trouble with this defense is that it requires the episode to work as satire to generate insight about the thing it's depicting, rather than simply reproducing it with cartoon characters. And A Shot in the Dark doesn't quite get there. The comedy it generates is too shallow, the character changes are too forced. Cleveland's behavior feels out of character in ways that undermine the episode's credibility, and the resolution is too convenient to carry the weight of what it's attempting to address. There's also a structural problem. The episode uses the Trayvon Martin framework but inverts a crucial element. In the original case, a vigilante shot an unarmed black teenager without justification. In the Family Guy version, Peter's shooting is genuinely accidental and without racial motivation. This inversion allows the episode to make points about false accusations of racism while largely avoiding engagement with the reality of actual racial violence. It takes the form of the Trayvon Martin situation while sidestepping the substance of why that situation mattered. The episode is not, on balance, an example of Family Guy succeeding at difficult material. It's an example of the show reaching for something more serious and meaningful than it was equipped to handle. The writers knew they were working with volatile material. The episode's production title alone tells you that. The delays tell you that the network knew it too. But the final product didn't justify the ambition. What it did accomplish was to generate a real conversation about whether animated comedy is an appropriate medium for engaging with ongoing racial tragedies. And the answer that most people landed on was yes, but only if the engagement is genuinely thoughtful, genuinely insightful, and genuinely willing to sit with the complexity of the subject. A Shot in the Dark was willing to sit with the topic but not quite with the complexity. The episode joins a short list of Family Guy installments alongside Screams of Silence that represent the show attempting serious social subjects and not having the tools to do them justice. The difference between these episodes and the show at its actual satirical best is instructive. When Family Guy was genuinely good at dark comedy, it usually worked because the comedy was layered, because the jokes operated on multiple levels simultaneously, and because the target of the ridicule was clearly something worth ridiculing. When it struggled, it was usually because it had picked up a serious subject without knowing exactly what it wanted to say about it, and the jokes collapsed into either offense for its own sake or satire without insight. A Shot in the Dark is, in the final analysis, a case study in the limits of what Family Guy, or perhaps what any cartoon in this genre, can do with the most urgent and painful dimensions of American racial life. The show's signature tools, cutaway gags, cartoon violence, irreverent humor, dark absurdism, are genuinely powerful tools for certain kinds of comedy. They are not the right tools for sitting with the grief and the ongoing injustice of what happened to Trayvon Martin or to the thousands of others whose stories resemble his. Section 11. The Moments That Went Too Far, Censored, Cut, and Controversial Gags. Beyond the landmark controversies, the banned episodes, the record-breaking complaint counts, the episodes pulled after real tragedies, Family Guy has accumulated over 25 years, a second layer of controversy that runs throughout the show's entire history. These are the individual moments, the specific cutaway gags, the particular jokes that were censored for broadcast, edited out of reruns, removed from streaming platforms, or simply generated enough backlash that they became permanently associated with the show's complicated reputation. This section is a journey through some of those moments. It's a quieter kind of survey than what came before, not the major crises, but the ambient controversy, the background radiation of a show that was perpetually testing what it could get away with. One of the earliest such moments involves the John F. Kennedy Pez dispenser. In a Season 1 episode specifically, in the episode Road to Rhode Island, a brief scene depicts a child at a show-and-tell or similar gathering who brings a collection of Pez dispensers. Among them is one modeled on the head of President John F. Kennedy. When another child asks what's special about the Kennedy dispenser, the first child flicks the top of the dispenser, the action by which Pez dispensers release candy, and the head flies backward in a gesture clearly recalling the Zapruder film footage of Kennedy's assassination. The joke is brief. It lasts perhaps 2 seconds. It was cut from Fox broadcast airings after initial complaints about its depiction of the assassination. The joke's humor comes from the perfect formal correspondence between a child's toy mechanism and the most traumatic public moment in American presidential history, from the collision of the mundane and the horrific. It was dark, it was clever, and it was apparently just past what Fox was comfortable airing on the network in certain contexts. The deletion of individual moments like this reveals something important about how broadcast standards actually work in practice. The official process by which content is reviewed, flagged, and approved or rejected is not simply about major categories of content. It's about specific images, specific phrases, specific joke structures that the network standards department decides cross a line that might not be formally defined anywhere. The World Trade Center references represent another category of self-censorship that the show engaged in after the 11th of September 2001. Several early Family Guy scenes included the Twin Towers as part of New York City skylines, as visual references and passing jokes, or as background elements. After September 11th, these scenes were edited in reruns and home releases to remove the towers. The show's production team made this decision without being required to. It was a choice to honor the ongoing sensitivity of the subject rather than a response to regulatory pressure. MacFarlane himself had a personal connection to September 11th that made his approach to the subject more complex than it might otherwise have been. He was booked on American Airlines Flight 1 on the morning of the 11th of September 2001, one of the planes that struck the World Trade Center. He missed the flight because of a late night and an overslept morning. This coincidence has been a subject of public fascination, and MacFarlane has spoken about it with a mixture of disbelief and ongoing gratitude for the accident of timing that kept him alive. Given this background, the show's handling of 9/11 references was always more personal than it might appear from outside. MacFarlane made some jokes about the subject over the years, and each one generated its share of criticism. The Turban Cowboy episode already covered was the most significant. But the broader pattern of how the show navigated September 11th material carefully, inconsistently, always aware of the potential for real hurt, reflects an awareness of the topic's weight that was partly personal. The Stewie bin Laden sequence in the episode When You Wish Upon a Weinstein offers another window into this territory. This episode, the show's 22nd episode of Season 3, had its own complicated history. It was delayed for years by Fox, before finally airing because of concerns about anti-Semitic content in the episode's main storyline. But within the episode, there was a brief cutaway showing Stewie distracting airport security with a song and dance routine while smuggling weapons through the security checkpoint. Following this, a brief gag showed Osama bin Laden using the same technique. The sequence aired initially before September 11th concerns had fully crystallized in television content standards. In reruns and on DVD, it was cut removed from official releases because the bin Laden gag had become far more sensitive following the 2001 attacks. The version of the episode that exists in most current streaming contexts is missing this sequence. This pattern of retroactive editing is worth noticing. Family Guy has an unusually long catalog of moments that were altered in post-broadcast versions. Scenes removed, lines changed, dialogue bleeped or replaced. The censorship of Family Guy wiki page, which documents these changes in remarkable detail, runs to dozens of pages worth of specific alterations by episode and season. The show's content was not static, it was continuously revised as standards, sensitivities, and the show's own self-understanding evolved. The George W. Bush beer bong card is another small example. In an early season episode, Brian sings a song that includes a visual card depicting a drunken George W. Bush holding a beer bong. Fox edited this for broadcast, replacing the Bush image with a Jerry Springer graphic. The original has since been restored in later releases, but the initial edit reveals how carefully Fox monitored political content that might attract charges of improper commentary on sitting presidents. The show's approach to racial humor generated its own ongoing series of specific controversies. Multiple episodes included jokes about various racial and ethnic communities that generated complaints from the communities being targeted. The show's defenders consistently invoked the equal opportunity offender framework, that it targeted everyone equally and therefore couldn't be characterized as having animus toward any particular group. Critics of this framework pointed out that equal opportunity offense is not the same as equal opportunity harm, and that some communities have significantly less power to absorb public ridicule than others. The Simpsons crossover episode in 2014 generated a specific controversy when a trailer for the episode included a scene in which Stewie makes a prank call to Moe's Tavern, the same call pattern established by Bart Simpson as a recurring joke in the original series. In Bart's version, the calls involve increasingly elaborate, punnable names that the bar owner reads aloud in innocence. In Stewie's version, the call involved telling Moe that his sister was being raped. PTC President Tim Winter wrote directly to Simpsons creator Matt Groening, to MacFarlane, and to Fox about this joke. He argued that jokes about rape normalize rape in real life by reducing its perceived severity. This argument had been made many times against many pieces of entertainment, and it sits in the contested territory of questions about whether depictions or mentions of harmful acts in comedic contexts contribute to those acts occurring in reality. MacFarlane, in his interview with Entertainment Weekly about the episode, said with the acknowledged awareness that it would draw criticism that he found the joke genuinely funny. He made this statement knowing it would generate backlash. He made it anyway. The rape joke controversy highlights a dimension of Family Guy's controversies that runs throughout the show's history. The question of whether any subject is inherently off-limits for comedy. MacFarlane's consistent position has been that nothing is off-limits if the comedy is well-crafted. Critics have consistently responded that the craft of the comedy does not resolve questions about the harm the comedy might cause. There is probably no clean resolution to this disagreement. It has existed since comedy began, and it will exist as long as comedy continues. What Family Guy's history demonstrates is that the disagreement has real stakes, that people on both sides of it care deeply about something important, and that the history of specific controversies does not resolve into a clean narrative about who was right. What it does is accumulate. Each censored moment, each cut gag, each retroactive edit is a small piece of evidence in an enormous ongoing argument about what comedy can do, what it should do, and what it costs when it does things that leave people hurt. Family Guy made that argument louder and longer than almost any other show in the history of American television, and it never stopped making it. Section 12. Seth MacFarlane's regrets and the legacy of controversy. There is a particular kind of honesty that requires a person to look back at the things they made when they were young and confident and admit, publicly, that it was more complicated than they understood at the time. Not to disavow everything, not to perform regret as a PR exercise, but to actually reckon with the gap between what they intended and what they produced, and what the distance between those two things has meant for the people it touched. Seth MacFarlane reached that moment, at least partially, in an interview with CBS Sunday Morning that aired in 2023. When asked about the show's history of controversial content, he reflected on the philosophy he had brought to the early years. The attitude was essentially that nothing mattered, that if something was funny, you did it, full stop. And then, as he described it, the older he got, the more he found himself looking back and recognizing that it was a little more complicated than that. That comedy and jokes do have an impact. This admission did not go far enough for some of the show's critics. It went further than many expected from a creator who had spent 2 decades defending virtually every controversial element of his work, with a posture that ranged from dismissive to combative. MacFarlane calling the PTC comparable to Hitler's hate mail, shrugging off rape joke controversies, dismissing AIDS organizations' concerns about the barbershop quartet gag, these were not the postures of someone inclined toward self-examination. But something had shifted. Age has a way of doing that. The distance from the original creative decisions, combined with the accumulated weight of evidence about how specific jokes had landed in the culture over 2 decades, had produced something that looked, at least partially, like genuine reflection. What does it mean for a show to reckon with its own controversial legacy while continuing to produce new episodes? Family Guy is still in production. As of the 2025 announcement, it has been renewed through season 27, which will take the show to the 2028 to 2029 television season, coinciding with its 30th anniversary. Each season under the new deal will consist of 15 episodes. The show is not going away, so the reckoning MacFarlane was attempting to conduct in that CBS Sunday Morning interview was not the reckoning of someone looking back on something finished. It was the reckoning of someone in the middle of something ongoing, someone who has more episodes to make and who is trying to figure out, in real time, how to make them with a different level of awareness than he brought to the work when he was 25 years old. The show has changed in ways that reflect this. The meg-abuse that characterized many middle seasons has largely been dialed back. The representation of female characters generally has become somewhat more nuanced as more women join the writing staff. Some of the racial humor that characterized earlier seasons has been reconsidered. These are not dramatic transformations, and the show has not become a fundamentally different piece of television. But there are small evolutions visible to anyone who has watched the whole run. The cast has also changed in a significant way. In the summer of 2020, amid the broad cultural conversation about race and representation in entertainment that followed George Floyd's murder, Mike Henry, a white actor who had voiced Cleveland Brown, the show's primary black character, since the first season announced that he would be leaving the role, Henry said that he felt strongly that Cleveland should be voiced by a black actor, and that voices of color need to be heard in animated series. Arif Zahir, a black comedian and impressionist, took over the role beginning with season 19. This was a meaningful change. Family Guy had featured a black character voiced by a white actor for 18 seasons, which was part of a broader pattern in American animation where characters of color were routinely voiced by white performers. The decision to make the change was part of a broader reckoning across the animation industry, and it reflected a kind of self-examination that the show had not always been inclined toward. These changes do not erase the show's history. They don't address every criticism that has been leveled against it over 25 years. They are partial and incomplete responses to an enormous accumulation of questions about representation, harm, and responsibility. But they are real changes, and they matter. The legacy of Family Guy's controversies is, in the end, as complicated as the controversies themselves. The show generated enormous cultural conversation about the limits of comedy and the responsibilities of entertainment. It forced regulatory agencies, advocacy organizations, advertising companies, and television networks to work out positions on questions about what should be permissible on broadcast television. It provided ammunition for people who believed that popular culture was becoming coarser and more harmful and it provided entertainment for millions of people who believed that the freedom to satirize anything was worth protecting. It also undeniably caused harm in specific ways to specific communities. The domestic violence episode communicated damaging misinformation. The transgender episode reinforced stereotypes and disgust responses. The racial humor in various installments added to, rather than subtracted from the stock of degrading images in the culture. These things happened. They had effects? The effects were real even when they were not measurable. At the same time, the show that made these mistakes was also the show that produced Road to Germany's haunting depiction of the invasion of Poland, and Brian and Stewie's devastating conversation in the bank vault, and episodes that genuinely illuminated something true about American family life, American culture, and the particular comedy of being human in the modern world. Family Guy is, taken all the way around, one of the most complex cases in the history of popular entertainment. It was at various times brilliant and lazy, empathetic and cruel, genuinely funny and genuinely harmful. It generated more formal regulatory complaints, more advertiser pressure campaigns, and more sustained critical attention than almost any show that has ever aired on American television. And through all of it, it kept going. The controversies it leaves behind are not clean lessons. They don't organize into a simple narrative about whether the show was good or bad, responsible or irresponsible, worth defending or worth criticizing. They are a record of a long, loud, ongoing argument between a creative team that believed in the freedom to satirize everything and a culture that kept asking whether every use of that freedom was wise. That argument is not over. It will not be over for as long as the show continues to air, and probably for decades after. The episodes are in the archive. The conversations they generated are in the record. And anyone who wants to understand what American popular culture was willing to say and argue about and laugh at and regret in the first quarter of the 21st century can find it all there in the full, messy, unresolvable catalog of a show that was always exactly as controversial as it intended to be, and sometimes considerably more than it anticipated. Section 13, the Alex Sulkin tweets, cast controversies, and behind-the-scenes drama. The controversies surrounding Family Guy were never confined to the screen. Over the years, the people who made the show became subjects of controversy in their own right, and the off-screen dramas became as significant as anything in the episodes themselves. Alex Sulkin was a longtime writer and showrunner on Family Guy, joining the staff in the show's early years and eventually rising to one of its top creative positions. He was, by the accounts of those who knew him in the industry, a genuinely talented comedy writer, one of the key architects of the show's tone and direction through some of its most significant years. He is also someone whose public record outside the show became a source of significant controversy. In 2011, following the massive earthquake and tsunami that struck Japan and caused the Fukushima nuclear disaster, Sulkin posted a tweet that read, and this is a direct quotation from the public record, that if the Japanese loved America so much, maybe they wouldn't have bombed Pearl Harbor. The tweet was interpreted by many as a suggestion that the Japanese earthquake and tsunami were somehow related to or deserved because of Japan's actions during World War II. The public response was swift and intensely negative. Sulkin deleted the tweet and offered an apology, acknowledging that it was a terrible joke and expressing regret. The episode is notable for several reasons. It demonstrates the way that social media created a new dimension of controversy for the people behind controversial shows. In the pre-internet era, what a writer said privately or even in a professional setting was rarely subject to the same kind of public scrutiny as the show's broadcast content. Twitter changed that. The people who made Family Guy were now public figures whose every public utterance was subject to the same level of attention as the show itself. Sulkin's tweet was worse, in one sense, than most Family Guy controversies, because it was not embedded in a satirical context. It was not a joke in an episode where the target of the humor was clear. It was a first-person statement in a medium where the author is not playing a character, where no narrative distance exists between the speaker and the sentiment. The tweet read as a genuine expression of a view, even if it was intended as dark humor, and the view it expressed was offensive to survivors and descendants of a natural disaster in which nearly 20,000 people died. Sulkin remained with the show. He continued in his role as showrunner and continued to receive credit on the series. The show did not publicly address the controversy or indicate any change in his status. The racial humor associated with certain cast members created another dimension of behind-the-scenes controversy. When Mike Henry stepped down as Cleveland Brown in 2020, his statement was careful and genuine. He framed it as a recognition that the industry needed to do better, that his own participation in the pattern of white actors voicing characters of color had been part of something worth changing, and that he was stepping back voluntarily rather than under pressure. The clarity and grace of that exit was notable partly because it contrasted with how many similar situations in the entertainment industry had played out. Henry's willingness to name the problem, accept his own role in it, and step aside without drama or defensiveness was, in context, an unusually direct kind of accountability. The broader conversation about who voices what in animation opened questions that extended to other characters and other shows beyond Family Guy. But Cleveland Brown was the most prominent example within this particular series, and the transition to Arif Zahir was completed with more smoothness than many industry observers expected. Zahir brought his own interpretation to the character while remaining faithful to the core of what Henry had created over 18 seasons, and the show continued without the disruption that can sometimes accompany major cast changes. There were also controversies about individual episodes that touched on their writers more specifically. The Screams of Silence episode was written by Alex Sulkin, adding another layer to questions about Sulkin's sensitivities around certain kinds of subject matter. The episode's mishandling of domestic violence dynamics, criticized by professionals in the field, reflected specific creative choices that the writer and showrunner made. The character of Brenda's inability to leave her abuser was not something that happened by accident. It was written deliberately, with specific dialogue that positioned victim behavior as stupidity or weakness. That those specific choices reflected and compounded harmful, real-world misconceptions about abuse was a problem attributable to the episode's authorship. The production relationship between MacFarlane and Fox was its own ongoing source of background drama, if not always public controversy. MacFarlane's frustrations with the network were expressed publicly in increasingly direct terms over the years. His 2021 social media post expressing that Tucker Carlson's commentary made him wish Family Guy was on any other network was remarkable for its directness. The show's creator publicly declaring embarrassment about being associated with the network that carried the show. His analogy of the relationship to a failing marriage suggested something deeper than ordinary creative frustration. The 2020 deal with NBC Universal, reportedly worth approximately $200 million over 5 years, represented MacFarlane's concrete investment in building a future outside the Fox ecosystem. His newer projects, The Orville, the TED series, production of other content were going through networks and platforms that had no connection to Fox. Family Guy, contractually obligated to Fox, was the link that held him there. And it was a link he had described publicly in terms that made his feelings about it clear. This dynamic, a creator contractually tied to a network he publicly wished he wasn't working for, making a show he had described in terms of financial utility rather than artistic passion, with writers whose public behavior had generated controversies of their own, is not a picture of a creative enterprise operating at its best. And yet the show continued. New episodes were written, new controversies were generated, the machine kept turning. The behind-the-scenes story of Family Guy is, in some ways, more complicated than the on-screen controversies, because it involves real human beings navigating real professional relationships and real consequences, rather than animated characters whose damage can be limited to the fictional world. The people who made the show had to live in the world that the show helped shape, and some of them carried the weight of specific controversies in ways that affected their professional lives and personal reputations. MacFarlane carries the weight of a 25-year enterprise that he no longer fully controls, and that has produced work he is proud of, alongside work that, by his own admission, he now recognizes was more complicated than he understood when he made it. That's a specific kind of burden. It's the burden of someone who built something very large and very influential, and then watched it develop in directions that were partly beyond his control. The show's controversies, seen from this angle, are not just about individual episodes. They are about the long-term consequences of creating something that outlasts the intentions that created it, that takes on a life determined by hundreds of creative decisions made by dozens of writers across 3 decades, and that shapes culture in ways that accumulate beyond anything that any single episode or moment could accomplish or predict. Section 14. What the controversies actually tell us. We've traveled a long way together through the complicated archive of Family Guy's most controversial moments. From the earliest days when the Parents Television Council launched letter-writing campaigns to get the show canceled, through the landmark controversies of specific episodes and the personal dramas of the people who made them, to Seth MacFarlane sitting in a CBS studio looking back at a body of work that he acknowledges now requires more nuance than he gave it at the time. What does it all tell us? The easiest answer and the least useful one is that Family Guy was simply a controversial show, that it courted controversy deliberately as part of its brand, and that the controversies were therefore to be expected and not especially meaningful. But this answer, though partially true, misses too much. The controversies mattered. They mattered to the AIDS organizations that protested the Barbershop Quartet. They mattered to the survivors and families of Boston Marathon bombing victims who saw their grief entangled with an edited YouTube video. They mattered to transgender people who saw their identity treated as a source of physical revulsion and cultural mockery. They mattered to Christian communities who found their faith treated as a target for sustained irreverence. They mattered to advocates for domestic violence survivors who saw the complicated psychology of abuse reduced to a punchline about stupidity. In each of these cases, real people who carried real wounds found those wounds pressed by the actions of a television program that did not mean, in most cases, to do anything more than generate laughs. The gap between what Family Guy intended and what it sometimes produced is a profound lesson in the relationship between creative intent and cultural impact. At the same time, the controversies tell a story about American culture's ongoing negotiation with its own values. Every time the PTC launched a campaign against Family Guy, they were making a statement about what kind of entertainment Americans should have access to and who should decide. Every time the FCC declined to act against the show, it was making a statement about the limits of regulatory authority over expression. Every time an advertiser pulled its ads and then returned, it was making a statement about the relationship between commercial interests and content standards. These negotiations were not abstract. They involved real money, real institutions, and real power. And they produced, over 25 years, something that functions as a kind of public record of where American culture drew and redrew its lines in the first quarter of the 21st century. Family Guy was controversial because it was always asking, in ways explicit and implicit, where the line was. Sometimes it found the line and stood right on top of it. Sometimes it crossed the line and kept going without looking back. Sometimes it approached what looked like the line and stopped short, and the restraint was itself a kind of comment. And sometimes the most interesting cases the line moved after the episode aired, and what had seemed acceptable at the time of broadcast became, in retrospect, clearly something else. This is the nature of the relationship between art and culture. They move together, influence each other, sometimes painfully. What Family Guy got wrong in specific episodes was real. What it got right in its best satire, its sharpest comedy, its most honest moments was also real. The show was large enough to contain both, and its controversies were the sound of those contradictions working themselves out in public. The 30 years of Family Guy that are coming the show is already past 25, and its newest deal takes it to 30 will continue this process. New episodes will be made. New jokes will be written. Some of them will generate backlash. Some of that backlash will be justified. Some of it won't be. And the ongoing argument about what comedy can and should do will continue, with Family Guy as one of its loudest and longest-running exhibits. MacFarlane's reflection that comedy has an impact, that it's more complicated than he understood when he was young, is a beginning rather than a conclusion. The show's work of reckoning with its own legacy is incomplete, probably permanently. Complete reckonings with things this large and this entangled with culture and with real human experience don't happen. They are ongoing processes, extended over time, built piece by piece in individual episodes and interviews, and cast changes and creative decisions. What we can say, looking at the full sweep of the controversies cataloged in this video, is that Family Guy's 25 years represent one of the most thorough stress tests of American television's relationship with controversy that any show has ever conducted. It tested regulatory limits, it tested advertiser tolerance, it tested audience patience. It tested the cultural conversation about what entertainment is for and who it is responsible to. Those tests produced conclusions that are characteristically complicated. The show survived everything. The controversies didn't kill it. The complaints didn't shut it down. The pulled episodes came back to streaming. The fired actors were replaced. The creator expressed partial regret, and the show continued. And the audience, the tens of millions of people who have watched Family Guy at some point across its run, who have laughed at the cutaway gags and winced at the dark moments and argued with friends about whether specific jokes crossed lines, those people are also part of the story. Their ongoing engagement with the show, through all of its most uncomfortable moments, tells you something about how large the appetite is for this particular kind of entertainment and how durable its hold on the culture has been. Family Guy will eventually end. Probably not soon, given the New Deal, but eventually. And when it does, the archive of controversies we've covered in this video will be part of what people use to understand what the show was. Not the whole story, but a significant part of it. The record of a show that was always pushing, always asking where the line was, and whose answers to that question revealed, over and over again, more about American culture than about any single episode or any single joke. That's what the controversies actually tell us. Not that the show was good or bad, irresponsible or brave, worth watching or worth avoiding, but that it was alive. Alive and fighting and generating friction at every edge it had. And that the friction it generated left marks on the culture, some of them painful, some of them useful, and all of them worth understanding. Section 15. The Quiet Hours. A Final Reflection. By now, the night has gotten late wherever you are. The world outside is quieter. The sounds that fill a waking day have retreated. Whatever room you're in, whatever position you found, the contents of this video have moved through you like a long story told at the end of an evening. Something that asked you to think and feel and sit with uncomfortable things, and then let you set them down. The story of Family Guy's controversies is, in the end, a very human story. It's the story of people who were young and talented and full of confidence, making things that pushed against every limit they could find. It's the story of other people and advocacy organizations and regulatory agencies and church pews and support groups responding to those things with genuine feeling, with arguments that deserve to be heard, with concerns that reflected real values and real wounds. It's the story of a culture negotiating with itself, loudly and in public, about what kind of entertainment it wanted to have and what kind it was willing to protect. None of the people in this story were entirely right. None of them were entirely wrong. Seth MacFarlane was genuinely talented and also, by his own eventual admission, not always as thoughtful as he should have been about the impact of his work. The PTC was genuinely concerned about something real, the nature of what reaches children through popular culture, even if their methods were often blunt and their specific judgments often questionable. The advocacy organizations that responded to specific episodes were speaking from genuine experience of harm, and the show's defenders were speaking from genuine experience of comedy as a form of truth-telling and freedom. All of these things were true simultaneously. The complexity of that simultaneous truth is something that the darkness and the quiet are good for sitting with. In the noise of the day, when arguments are happening in real time and positions need to be staked out and defended, nuance is expensive. But in the small hours, when nothing is required of you except to be present and let things settle, the complexity can just exist. Family Guy was a show that contained multitudes. Its controversies were a record of those multitudes in conflict with each other, with the culture around them, and with the better and worse instincts of the people who made them. That conflict is part of what made the show worth watching, and part of what made it worth arguing about, and part of what makes it worth understanding now, in retrospect, with the distance that time gives us. So wherever you are tonight, whatever city, whatever country, whatever small corner of the world you've found to rest in, let the rest of it go. Let the controversies settle into the archive where they belong. Let the arguments quiet down. And let yourself be exactly where you are, which is exactly where you need to be. The show went on. The culture went on. The arguments went on. They'll continue. But for right now, in this quiet moment, none of that is required of you. Just rest. If this video helped you through a late night or an early morning, the kindest thing you can do is hit the subscribe button and leave a like. It takes a moment, and it genuinely keeps this channel going. If you've been here all the way to the end, thank you, from the bottom of this quiet corner of the internet. See you on the next one. Total estimated word count, 30,000 plus words. Section 16. When the jokes weren't jokes, real-world echoes across 25 years. One of the most persistent and unsettling patterns in Family Guy's long history of controversy is the way specific animated jokes have periodically collided with real-world events in ways that transformed them from dark comedy into something much harder to categorize. The Turban Cowboy situation was the most dramatic and most famous example, but it was not the only one. Over 25 years of weekly production, a show that regularly trafficked in catastrophe, violence, cultural flashpoints, and political controversy was always operating with the statistical probability that some of its content would eventually align, accidentally, with something that actually happened. This section is about those alignments and what they reveal about the relationship between comedy and the world it comments on. The Venezuela incident around the Season 7 episode 420, in which Brian leads a successful campaign to legalize marijuana in the fictional town, generated a response from the actual Venezuelan government that nobody in the Family Guy writers' room had anticipated. Venezuela's justice minister, at the time, cited the episode specifically as an example of the United States using entertainment to promote drug use among young people. Cable stations in Venezuela that continued to air Family Guy were warned they would face fines. The episode was effectively banned from Venezuelan television. This was a remarkable outcome. A cartoon about a talking dog running a pro-marijuana campaign had generated an official government response from a foreign nation. The Venezuelan government's concern may have been genuine, or it may have been politically motivated. Relations between Venezuela and the United States during this period were notably strained, and anti-American cultural criticism was a useful political tool. But the underlying dynamic was real. A piece of American entertainment had reached far enough into global culture that its specific content became an object of formal governmental concern in another country. Family Guy generated similar international friction on other occasions. The show's treatment of various national stereotypes, British, Canadian, Asian, European, generated complaints from communities in those countries who found specific portrayals offensive. The show's massive syndication reach meant that episodes that were products of a specific American cultural moment arrived in other cultural contexts, where the same jokes landed very differently. The Simpsons crossover episode from 2014 generated pre-broadcast controversy through a single scene in its promotional materials. The crossover was one of the most anticipated crossover events in the history of animated television. Two of the most iconic animated franchises of their era appearing in the same episode. The promotional materials for the episode included a scene in which Stewie makes a prank call to Moe's Tavern, the bar in Springfield run by Moe Szyslak, which is the location of one of the most famous running gags in Simpsons history. Bart's elaborate prank calls that have Moe paging men with crude or punnable names to the bar's humiliation. In Stewie's version of the prank call, he tells Moe that his sister is being raped. This is the line that the PTC president Tim Winter found offensive enough to write directly to Matt Groening, Seth MacFarlane, and Fox before the episode even aired. Winter's argument was the one that has been made about comedy involving sexual violence across many different contexts. That jokes about rape normalize it in real life, making it seem less serious, less outrageous, and therefore less likely to be taken seriously by people who might otherwise intervene or report it. MacFarlane's response, given to Entertainment Weekly, was that he found the joke genuinely funny, an admission he paired with the acknowledgement that it would draw criticism and that he was prepared to absorb that criticism. This is a specific kind of creative position, making a choice you know will generate backlash and choosing to make it anyway, for what you consider the right artistic reasons. Whether those reasons were actually sufficient is the kind of question that doesn't have a clean answer. The relationship between comedy about sexual violence and the real-world incidents and treatment of sexual violence is genuinely contested in social science research. Some research has found correlations between exposure to media that trivializes sexual violence and reduced empathy for victims. Other research has challenged this finding on methodological grounds. The debate is real and it is not resolved. What is clear is that people who have survived sexual violence often find jokes about it harmful in ways that go beyond simple offense. They describe the experience of hearing their trauma turned into a punchline as a specific kind of re-injury. Whether that experience should be dispositive for comedy creators is the question at the center of the debate. What Family Guy's specific history adds to this conversation is a set of concrete examples, specific jokes, specific responses, specific downstream effects that allow the question to be examined in context rather than in the abstract. The Simpsons crossover rape joke, the Screams of Silence episode's treatment of domestic violence, the accumulated record of crude sexual humor across hundreds of episodes, these are not hypotheticals. They are documented events with documented responses from documented communities. The record is available for examination. The show's history also includes a smaller category of controversy that is worth mentioning. Moments where the show's dark jokes aligned not with external tragedies, but with future information about people involved in the show's production. Several of MacFarlane's friends and collaborators have over the years been subjects of various professional or personal controversies, and the way those controversies intersected with the show's content created periodic awkward moments. These are, by comparison to the major controversies discussed elsewhere in this video, relatively minor. But they add to the picture of a show operating in a very particular cultural moment, among very particular people, with the specific vulnerabilities and blind spots that come with those specific circumstances. The broader question that all of these real-world echoes raise is one about responsibility, specifically about the responsibility that comes with making entertainment that reaches tens of millions of people on a weekly basis for 25 years. The argument that comedy is just comedy, that jokes are just jokes, that nothing that happens in an animated series has real-world consequences, becomes increasingly difficult to sustain in the face of the specific evidence provided by Family Guy's history. The Venezuelan government ban was a real-world consequence. The Boston Marathon situation was a real-world consequence. The experiences of domestic violence survivors watching Screams of Silence were real-world consequences. The experiences of trans women watching Quagmire's Dad were real-world consequences. None of these consequences were intended, but they were real. And over 25 years, the accumulated weight of unintended but real consequences is itself a kind of evidence. Evidence that the premise of consequence-free transgressive comedy is more complicated than it appeared when Family Guy first tested it. Section 17, The Writer's Room and the Question of Who Was in It. One of the most revealing but least discussed dimensions of Family Guy's controversies is the specific demographic composition of the people who produced the content who was in the writer's room, who wasn't, and what that absence or presence meant for the kinds of stories the show was able to tell and the kinds of harm it was able to avoid or inadvertently commit. Television writing rooms are not representative samples of the population. They have never been. The American television industry has historically been dominated by white, male, often coastal, often middle-class creators, and this has shaped the content that American television produces in ways that are deeply documented and extensively discussed. Family Guy was, in this respect, not unusual. Its writer's room in the early years was predominantly white and predominantly male, and many of the episodes that generated the most significant criticism from specific communities reflect, in retrospect, the specific limitations that come with a homogeneous creative team engaging with subjects outside their own experience. The domestic violence episode, Screams of Silence, was written by Alex Sulkin. The misinformation about domestic violence dynamics that characterizes the episode reflects the specific failure mode of a writer engaging with a subject he had no direct experience with and apparently had not thoroughly researched. The episode's portrayal of abuse survivors as simply too stupid to leave mirrors a common misunderstanding held by people who have never encountered the clinical literature on the subject or spoken with survivors about their actual experiences. A writing room that included people with that experience, writers who had survived domestic violence, or family members of survivors, or advocates for survivors, might have caught these errors before they became the episode's central message. Similarly, the transgender portrayals in Quagmire's Dad and the racial humor in various episodes reflect the specific blind spots of a creative team that was largely working from the outside of the experiences being depicted. This is not an accusation of bad faith. It is an observation about the structural relationship between who tells stories and what those stories get right or wrong. The addition of women to the Family Guy writing staff, which occurred in meaningful numbers only in later seasons, is directly correlated with the changes in how Meg Griffin is treated, Multiple industry sources and public statements from people involved with the show's production have connected the decrease in Meg's sustained abuse directly to the presence of female writers in the room who pushed back against content they found both unfunny and genuinely mean. This is a concrete example of the principle that representation in creative teams produces better work, or at least work that is less likely to inadvertently harm people whose experiences weren't represented in the room where the content was made. This is worth naming not to relitigate the specific controversy of any individual episode, but to understand something structural about how these controversies happened. They happened, in part, because of who was and wasn't in the room. The fix for any ongoing creative enterprise is not primarily about individual intentions or individual failures of sensitivity. It is about the structural composition of the creative team and the mechanisms by which different perspectives are included in or excluded from the process of making content. Family Guy's production history provides a kind of case study in the relationship between representation in creative production and quality of creative output, specifically in terms of avoiding harm to communities whose experiences are being depicted. The lesson is not subtle. Shows that include the communities they depict in their creative teams make fewer mistakes about those communities. The mistakes that Family Guy made about domestic violence, about transgender identity, about racial dynamics, about AIDS patients, these were not inevitable. They were predictable outcomes of a specific kind of creative structure that didn't include the perspectives that might have caught them. MacFarlane's reflection on the show's complicated legacy, his acknowledgement that comedy has impact, is more meaningful when you understand it in this structural context. The impact didn't happen because of individual bad intentions. It happened because of structural conditions that shaped what content got made and how. Changing those structural conditions, diversifying writing rooms, including the communities being depicted in the process of depicting them, is the most concrete form that reckoning can take. Section 18. The Digital Age and the Changing Nature of Controversy. Family Guy launched in 1999, in the world before Twitter, before YouTube, before Facebook, before the modern social media ecosystem that has transformed how entertainment controversies develop, spread, and resolve. Over the course of the show's run, this ecosystem emerged and matured, and the nature of Family Guy's controversies changed substantially in response. The early controversies, the PTC campaigns, the advertiser pressure, the FCC complaints were organized through traditional channels. The PTC had a mailing list and a membership base. It could direct its members to write letters to sponsors, to file FCC complaints, to organize viewership boycotts. This was effective as far as it went, but it was slow and it was constrained by the organizational capacity of the PTC itself. A complaint campaign that required people to navigate a regulatory process was necessarily limited in scale. The emergence of YouTube in 2005, the same year, Family Guy returned from cancellation changed this dynamic fundamentally. Suddenly, individual clips from Family Guy episodes could be extracted, uploaded, viewed independently of the show, and shared across networks. This created two related effects on the show's controversies. The first effect was the amplification of positive reception. Family Guy's most memorable cutaway gags became internet phenomena entirely independently of the show itself. People who had never watched an episode of Family Guy encountered specific clips on YouTube and through social media sharing, often without any context about the episode or the show. The show's most viral moments existed in a kind of free-floating cultural space, available for recontextualization and remixing in ways the original creators had not designed for. This amplification of the show's most quotable and most shared moments contributed to its cultural footprint in ways that Nielsen ratings couldn't fully capture. The second effect was the acceleration of controversy. When an episode aired and generated audience objection, the specific offending moments could now be extracted and circulated almost immediately, reaching audiences far beyond those who had watched the episode in its original broadcast. A specific clip could go viral with a specific criticism attached, reaching communities who might not normally watch Family Guy and who encountered the content specifically in the context of the controversy surrounding it. The Boston Marathon situation was the most extreme example of this second dynamic. The manipulation of the turban cowboy footage was only possible because of the clip-sharing culture that YouTube had established. The specific editing that combined two unrelated scenes into an apparent depiction of the bombing could be done by anyone with basic video editing software. It could be distributed immediately to millions of people. And in the hours immediately after a tragedy, when people were searching desperately for information and pattern and meaning, it could be believed by large numbers of people who would never have believed it under calmer circumstances. Social media also changed the accountability dynamics for people associated with the show. The Alex Sulkin tweet about the Japanese earthquake and tsunami, which would, in a pre-social media era, have been a private or semi-private statement to a small audience, was instead a public broadcast to his entire Twitter following, available for screenshot and circulation the moment it was posted. The capacity for public figures to make statements that only reach a small audience has largely disappeared in the social media era. Every public statement is potentially a broadcast. This change has had complicated effects on creative production. On one hand, it has created pressure for creators to be more thoughtful and more careful about what they produce, because the capacity for specific moments to be extracted from context and circulated with critical commentary has dramatically reduced the penalty for any given piece of controversial content is paid by specific people associated with the show, not just by the show as an abstraction. On the other hand, social media has also created a kind of permanent controversy culture in which no piece of entertainment is ever entirely free from scrutiny. Old episodes of Family Guy are regularly rediscovered by new audiences and assessed by the standards of the present rather than the standards of the time when they were made, generating controversies about content that is sometimes 20 years old. This has been a consistent dynamic across multiple seasons and multiple episodes, old Family Guy moments that were controversial when they aired, becoming subjects of renewed intense criticism when they are rediscovered by audiences on TikTok or Twitter who are encountering them for the first time. Whether this dynamic is healthy or not, whether the application of present standards to past work is fair, or whether it creates a kind of temporal unfairness to creators who made decisions in different cultural contexts, is itself a contested question. The argument for applying present standards is that harm doesn't have an expiration date. If a piece of content caused harm when it aired, the harm is not erased by time, and calling it out remains valuable regardless of when it was produced. The argument against is that creative decisions should be evaluated in the context of the cultural moment when they were made, that holding creators to standards that didn't exist when they worked is a form of retrospective punishment that discourages creative risk-taking. Family Guy sits in the middle of this debate with a catalog large enough and old enough to be subject to exactly this tension. Some episodes that were controversial in their original broadcast look worse from the present. Some look better. Some look exactly the same. The long archive is both a resource and a liability, available for both appreciation and critique in ways that are never fully within anyone's control. Section 19. The comedy of cruelty and its limits. One dimension of Family Guy's controversies that runs through all the specific episodes and moments discussed in this video, but that deserves its own direct treatment, is the question of cruelty as comedy. Specifically, how much of the show's humor is built on the suffering of specific characters, and what are the consequences of building comedy on that foundation? The most obvious example is Meg Griffin, the show's oldest daughter, whose treatment across the middle seasons of the show was covered in the transcript that framed this video's approach. But the pattern extends far beyond Meg. It includes the treatment of Joe Swanson, whose disability was increasingly mined for cheap laughs rather than acknowledged as a characteristic of a full person. It includes the treatment of Cleveland Brown, whose role in the ensemble shrank over the years as Cleveland became more of a punchline than a character. It includes specific recurring jokes that derive their humor from the humiliation or degradation of specific characters in ways that went beyond the kind of sharp character comedy that the early seasons did well. The distinction between sharp character comedy and cruelty-based comedy is real but subtle, and it's worth trying to define it precisely, because the line between them is exactly where Family Guy's quality problems most consistently live. Sharp character comedy finds humor in the specific, authentic human failures and contradictions of real characters. When Peter Griffin does something catastrophically stupid in Season 2, the humor comes from recognizing something specific about who Peter is, his particular combination of obliviousness and optimism, his refusal to acknowledge failure, his genuine love for his family coexisting with his inability to serve it well. The comedy is pointed but not cruel because it acknowledges Peter as a full human being whose flaws are part of a fuller picture. Cruelty-based comedy finds humor in the simple fact of a character's suffering or degradation without reference to any fuller picture of who that character is. When late-season Family Guy had Peter fart in Meg's face as a running gag, the humor, such as it was, derived from the specific humiliation of the act, rather than from anything true about Peter or Meg as characters. There was no insight, no recognition, no connection to anything authentic about the human experience. The joke was that someone was humiliated, and the humiliation was its own punchline. This distinction matters because cruelty-based comedy has a specific effect on audiences over time. Research on the psychology of humor has found that jokes about degradation and cruelty toward specific groups or individuals can, over time, affect audiences' attitudes toward those groups or individuals. This is the mechanism through which Meg's sustained abuse was, at its worst, not merely unfunny but actively harmful. Millions of viewers, watching season after season of her family treating her as less than human, were receiving a consistent message about the kind of treatment this character deserved, and by extension, about the kind of treatment people like her deserved. The show seemed to understand this, at least partially, which is why it produced episodes like Seahorse Seashell Party, an episode in which Meg finally confronts her family about how they've treated her, delivers an entirely accurate and emotionally powerful accounting of their behavior, and for a brief moment seems to be the beginning of real change. The show knew what it had been doing to Meg. The writers could articulate it clearly through Meg's own voice when they needed to. The problem was the reset button, the episode's resolution that sent Meg right back to being the family's punching bag, framed as her noble sacrifice to keep the family functional. This reset button pattern is one of the most damaging structural features of Family Guy's approach to its most controversial character content. It allowed the show to have the best of both worlds, the emotional weight of a moment of acknowledgement and apparent growth, and the ongoing comedy value of the status quo without paying the price that genuine change would require. It let the writers demonstrate that they understood what was wrong while continuing to do it anyway. The long-running nature of the show means that this pattern accumulated across hundreds of episodes in ways that were genuinely damaging to the coherence of the characters and to the audience's ability to take any moment of apparent change seriously. When Peter and Meg reconcile in one episode only for everything to reset by the next, the reconciliation becomes meaningless, not just in isolation, but retroactively. It devalues every previous moment of apparent growth, and it preemptively devalues every future one. This is the specific failure of cruelty-based comedy as a long-form strategy. In the short term, degradation humor can generate easy laughs. In the long term, it hollows out the characters who are its subjects and undermines the show's ability to do anything meaningful with them. The version of Meg Griffin who exists in the show's final seasons, somewhat more capable, somewhat less targeted for abuse, is a better character than the middle-season punching bag. But she is also a character whose potential was wasted for years, and that waste is the permanent cost of the creative decisions made in those middle seasons. The question of cruelty in comedy doesn't have a simple answer. Some of the most important comedy in history has been built on cruelty of a kind, on exposing the powerful, on making the sacred seem ridiculous, on refusing to treat the things that demand reverence with reverence. This kind of cruelty can be genuinely valuable, but Family Guy's cruelty was mostly not this kind. It was cruelty directed down the social hierarchy, rather than up it at characters who were already vulnerable, already outsiders, already marked as lesser. Peter's cruelty toward Meg, the family's contempt for Cleveland, the treatment of Joe Swanson's disability as a resource for cheap jokes, these were not uncomfortable truths about power. They were just the entertainment of watching someone get hurt. The show's best work was almost never cruelty-based. It was character-based, built on genuine recognition of something true about the human beings it depicted. The Brian and Stewie bank vault episode is one of the most praised episodes in the show's history precisely because it dropped cruelty entirely and built entirely on authentic character. Two people in a vault, talking honestly about who they were and what they feared and what they meant to each other. No one was hurt. No one was humiliated. The comedy came from the specific way these two specific people talked to each other in a specific situation. This is what the show was capable of at its best. The tragedy of the controversy record is that its best was so much better than its worst, and its worst was so much more prominent in public memory. Section 20. Looking forward and looking back. We are coming to the end of a very long journey through a very complicated archive. The night that began many hours ago, whenever you first put this on, has moved through its phases, the restlessness of early evening, the deepening quiet of the small hours, the particular stillness that lives just before dawn, when the world seems to hold its breath before beginning again. Family Guy is not, at the time of this video, a show in crisis. It has been renewed through season 27. It will celebrate its 30th anniversary as a going concern, still in production, still generating new episodes, still airing in syndication, and streaming on Hulu. The business case for its continuation is as strong as it has ever been, even as the creative case has become more complicated. The show exists and will continue to exist because it has built an economic infrastructure: syndication deals, streaming licenses, merchandise revenue, brand recognition that makes its continuation financially rational, regardless of any specific episode's quality. This is the long tail of success in American entertainment. The shows that achieve sufficient scale and longevity become, eventually, assets that exist independently of the creative vision that built them. They are managed rather than made. They are maintained rather than driven. The specific passion and urgency that characterized Family Guy's early seasons, the feeling that someone who cared deeply about something was steering it, has given way to the more efficient and less volatile process of professional content production. MacFarlane's 2024 statements about the show's continued existence, framing it in terms of financial utility and escape velocity, are honest descriptions of this reality. He is not a creator who has a burning story he needs to tell through Family Guy. He is a creator with many other projects and interests who maintains a contractual and financial relationship with a show that helped build his career. That's a legitimate position. It is not the position of someone whose creative fire is driving the machine. For viewers who love the show, and there are many of them, genuinely and consistently this is fine. A well-produced piece of entertainment doesn't require creative urgency behind it in order to be enjoyable. The voice performances remain strong, the animation is technically accomplished. Individual episodes still produce moments of genuine comedy. The show is, in its current phase, competent and professional, in a way that is entirely reasonable for a program that has been running for 30 years. For viewers who are trying to understand what the show meant not just as entertainment but as a cultural document, as a contribution to the ongoing American argument about comedy and its limits, the current phase is less interesting than the earlier ones. The controversies that defined the show's most significant years were products of specific creative ambitions, specific cultural moments, and specific individual voices. The show at escape velocity is a different thing from the show that was trying to do something genuinely difficult and sometimes getting it wrong. The controversies documented in this video will remain part of the show's permanent record. They will be referenced in discussions of television history, media criticism, LGBTQ representation, racial representation, religious satire, and the psychology of comedy for many years. Scholars of American popular culture will write about Family Guy's relationship to the cultural moment that produced it for decades after the show ends. The archive is large enough, rich enough, and consequential enough to sustain that kind of sustained attention. What that attention will find, I think, is a show that was genuinely important to American culture, not because it was always good, but because it was always consequential. It forced conversations that needed to be had. It made people articulate their own values by giving them something to react against. It demonstrated over and over again that entertainment has real stakes, that what appears on television in the evening hours reaches into people's lives and shapes their understanding of themselves and of others. The controversies were not separate from the show's cultural significance. They were its cultural significance. A show that generated no controversy would have generated no conversation. The controversy was the price of doing something that mattered enough to be worth fighting about. That's the most honest thing I know how to say about Family Guy. It was worth fighting about. It was worth defending, worth criticizing, worth examining carefully and with genuine attention to the actual experiences of the actual people who were affected by it. The show earned the decades of argument it received. And now, very late, in the particular quality of silence that belongs to this hour, the archive sits complete. All the episodes still streaming, all the moments still visible, all the arguments still available to be had by anyone who wants to have them. You've been with this video through all of it. That took something. Thank you for paying attention. Rest now. The morning is not far. If this kept you company through a long night, the single most useful thing you can do is subscribe and leave a like. It makes a genuinely meaningful difference to whether this channel can keep making things. Thank you for being here. See you on the next one. Section 21, the episodes that almost didn't exist. There is something quietly extraordinary about the fact that Family Guy has lasted as long as it has, not just because of the controversies, though those are extraordinary enough on their own, but because on at least 2 separate occasions, the show ceased to exist entirely. It was canceled, finished, done. And somehow, improbably, it came back stronger than it had ever been, with sharper edges and a louder voice than Fox had originally bargained for, when they first greenlit a weird little show about a bumbling Rhode Island father and his inexplicably talking dog. To understand why so many of Family Guy's most controversial episodes exist at all, you have to understand the unusual position Seth MacFarlane found himself in after the show's resurrection. When a television series gets canceled and then revived, there is usually a period of creative caution. Writers pull back, producers play it safe. Nobody wants to be responsible for killing the show a second time. The natural instinct, when you have been given a second chance, is gratitude, and gratitude tends to make people timid. MacFarlane went the other direction entirely. The first cancellation came in 2000, after just 2 seasons. Fox had grown uncertain about the show's ratings trajectory, and in May of that year they made the decision to pull it from the schedule. It was not a dramatic farewell, there was no official finale, no send-off episode. The show simply stopped airing, and most industry observers assumed it was gone for good. MacFarlane himself has described the experience as disorienting. He had built something that he believed in deeply, something unlike anything else on television at the time, and the network had decided, fairly quietly and without much fanfare, that it wasn't worth continuing. But something unusual happened in the years that followed. Adult Swim, the late-night programming block on Cartoon Network, began airing reruns of Family Guy in 2003. And those reruns found an audience that the original broadcasts had never quite captured: younger viewers, college students, people who stayed up late and watched television differently than the primetime demographic Fox had been targeting. The ratings for the reruns were, by some measures, more impressive than the original run had ever produced. And DVD sales told an even clearer story. Family Guy's first volume DVD release became one of the best-selling television DVD sets in history at that point, a fact that Fox executives could not reasonably ignore. The second cancellation came in 2002, after a brief third-season revival attempt, and it looked far more permanent than the first. By that point, MacFarlane had moved on to begin development on other projects. The writers had scattered. The voice cast had taken other work. Resurrecting the show would require rebuilding it almost from scratch, and there was no guarantee that the audience which had discovered it through reruns would actually show up for new episodes in sufficient numbers. They showed up when Family Guy returned in May 2005 with a new episode, the aptly titled North by North Quahog, which opened with Peter announcing that the show had been canceled by idiots and brought back by even bigger idiots. It drew over 11 million viewers. That was more than double what many of the third season episodes had managed. The show had not just survived, it had arrived. And the creative team, energized by the unlikelihood of their own return, proceeded to make some of the most boundary-pushing television of the decade. The resurrection changed the show's relationship with Fox in ways that matter for understanding the controversies that followed. MacFarlane was now, in a very real sense, a proven commodity. He had demonstrated that there was an audience for his specific kind of comedy, an audience loyal enough to drive DVD sales and rerun ratings even without new content. That gave him leverage. Not unlimited leverage, Fox still canceled episodes, still pushed back on specific gags, still made editorial decisions that occasionally frustrated the writers, but a degree of creative latitude that many showrunners never achieve. It also changed the show's relationship with risk. When you have already lost everything once and gotten it back, your appetite for caution shifts. The writers who returned for the post-revival seasons were not timid people, making careful calculations about what the audience would accept. They were people who had watched their show get canceled, seen it find new life, and come back to make exactly the television they wanted to make. The controversies that defined the show's middle and later years, the Holocaust episodes, the domestic violence story, the transgender plotlines, the political provocations were not the work of a creative team playing it safe. They were the work of people who had decided, consciously or not, that safety was not the point. This matters for the specific question of which episodes almost didn't exist at all, because the answer involves not just network decisions but the internal creative process of a show that had learned, from its own near-death experience, that there was no reward for caution. Screams of silence. The story of Brenda Q is one of the clearest examples. The episode, which depicted Quagmire's sister in an abusive relationship, was developed over a long period and faced significant internal debate before it was produced. Some writers felt the subject matter was too serious for the show's established tone. Others worried that the execution a full dramatic episode with almost no comedic elements would alienate the audience without delivering anything meaningful in return. The episode was nearly abandoned multiple times before a version was finally locked and produced. What pushed it through, by most accounts, was a combination of MacFarlane's personal investment in the subject matter and the show's post-revival confidence. MacFarlane had spoken publicly about the importance of occasionally using the platform of a popular animated comedy to engage with real-world issues, and domestic violence was an issue he felt the show could address with unusual directness. The episode that ultimately aired was not, critics agreed, entirely successful in its execution. But it existed because someone decided the risk was worth taking a decision that might have been much harder to make on a show that had never stared down cancellation and come out the other side. A similar dynamic shaped Partial Terms of Endearment, the banned abortion episode. The story of that episode's journey to non-existence in America is worth tracing in some detail because it illustrates not just Fox's limits, but the specific way those limits interacted with the show's creative ambitions. The episode was written and produced in 2010 as a fairly earnest engagement with the abortion debate. Lois agrees to be a surrogate mother for a couple she befriends, and the episode essentially walks through the competing arguments about reproductive choice without reaching a definitive conclusion. MacFarlane described it as a deliberately balanced treatment of an unbalanced debate. The writers had decided, somewhat unusually for a show that often came down firmly on one side of political questions, to present multiple perspectives and let viewers draw their own conclusions. Fox declined to air it. The network's explanation, delivered through representatives and never fully elaborated in public, was essentially that abortion was a subject so divisive that no framing, however balanced, would be acceptable to their broadcast standards. The episode wasn't graphically violent or sexually explicit. It didn't advocate a specific political position. It simply addressed a topic that Fox had determined was off the table for primetime broadcast television, regardless of how carefully it was handled. MacFarlane's response was instructive. He released the episode on DVD, included it in the Season 8 box set, and spoke openly about Fox's decision in interviews. He was not, by his own account, surprised. He had made the episode knowing it was likely to be rejected, and he had decided to make it anyway, because the show's post-revival position gave him the ability to produce content that might not air and still have it reach an audience through other channels. The DVD sales vindicated that calculation. Thousands of people watched Partial Terms of Endearment, despite it never appearing on American broadcast television, and the episode became, in its own quiet way, a kind of statement about the limits of network self-censorship in an era when physical media and later streaming could route around those limits entirely. There are other episodes that almost didn't exist for less philosophical reasons. Road to Germany, the Holocaust episode, nearly lost a crucial scene involving the Warsaw Ghetto because network standards reviewers felt the imagery was too intense for a Sunday night comedy block. The scene survived, but only after extended negotiations between the production team and Fox's broadcast standards department. Similar negotiations shaped the AIDS fundraiser sequence in Family Gay, which was originally considerably longer and more explicit before being trimmed to meet broadcast requirements. The A Shot in the Dark episode, which addressed racial profiling and the Trayvon Martin case, was delayed twice after real-world events rendered its original air date inappropriate. The Paris terrorist attacks of November 2015 pushed it back once. The San Bernardino shooting pushed it back again. By the time the episode finally aired in December 2015, the writers had revised it multiple times, adjusting the framing to account for a national conversation that had continued to evolve in the months since the episode was originally completed. The version that aired was markedly different from the version that had been written, and whether it was better or worse for those revisions is a question the writers themselves have answered in contradictory ways in different interviews. What connects all of these stories is the same underlying reality. Controversial television does not emerge fully formed from a single act of creative audacity. It is the product of negotiation, revision, compromise, and occasionally outright rejection. The episodes that became controversies were not the ones that sailed through the production process unchallenged. They were the ones that someone at some point almost decided not to make and then made anyway, for reasons that varied from episode to episode but always involved, somewhere in the chain of decisions, a person who decided that the discomfort was worth the result. That is not a simple thing. Discomfort, in the abstract, is easy to advocate for. In practice, it means making choices that will invite criticism, generate complaints, and occasionally produce genuine harm for people who encounter the content at a vulnerable moment. The writers of Screams of Silence made a genuine effort to portray domestic violence with accuracy. The episode still drew criticism from advocates who felt it failed the people it was trying to depict. The writers of Quagmire's Dad made a genuine effort to portray transgender experience with sympathy. The episode still hurt transgender viewers who found the execution mocking rather than empathetic. Good intentions are not sufficient. The history of Family Guy's most controversial episodes is, in part, a history of good intentions meeting real-world consequences that the writers did not fully anticipate. And that history matters not because it excuses the failures, but because it complicates the easy narrative that controversial television is simply the product of careless people who didn't care who they hurt. The people who made these episodes cared. They got things wrong anyway. That is a more difficult truth than either the critics or the defenders of the show have generally been willing to sit with. Settle in a little deeper now. The room is quiet. The day is behind you. There is nothing that needs to be decided tonight, nothing that needs to be solved, just the long, slow unraveling of a story that is almost done. Section 22. Fandom, Backlash, and the Internet Age. Family Guy did not just survive the Internet age. In many ways, it defined it. This is not an obvious claim, and it requires some unpacking. When people talk about television shows that shaped online culture, they tend to reach for prestige dramas, the shows that generated think pieces and fan theories and elaborate Reddit analyses. Family Guy is not usually in that conversation. It is too broad, too irreverent, too deliberately anti-serious to attract the kind of earnest intellectual engagement that drives the prestige TV discourse. And yet, in the specific way that internet culture relates to television comedy through clips, memes, reaction images, out-of-context screenshots, Family Guy has had an influence that few other shows can match. The clip culture that defines how most people experience Family Guy today was not an accident. The show was, from its earliest seasons, structured in a way that made individual moments easily extractable from their context. The cutaway gag format in which the narrative pauses to visit an unrelated comic scenario produces content that functions independently of the episode it comes from. You do not need to have seen a Mission Impossible to understand the chicken fight. You do not need to know who Meg Griffin is to find the Conway Twitty scene funny or baffling or both simultaneously. Family Guy generates, almost by design, content that travels. This structural feature has had profound consequences for how the show's controversies have played out online. When a Family Guy clip goes viral, it typically goes viral in one of two ways, either as an example of the show's humor, shared approvingly by fans who enjoy it, or as an example of the show's offensiveness, shared critically by people who want to illustrate what they object to. Both circulation patterns strip the clip from its original context. Both circulation patterns tend to amplify the show's impact in ways that have nothing to do with the episode it came from. The Turban Cowboy conspiracy theory is perhaps the clearest example of this dynamic. The clip that circulated after the Boston Marathon bombing appearing to show Family Guy predicting the attack was itself a product of context removal. The two scenes that were edited together came from entirely different parts of the same episode and were never juxtaposed in the original broadcast. The conspiracy theory was, at its heart, a misuse of clip culture, an extraction of moments from their context, a recombination that created a false impression, and a rapid viral spread that outpaced any fact-checking or correction. Alex Jones amplified it. It reached millions of people. The fact that it was straightforwardly false did not stop it from becoming, for a certain corner of the internet, a settled piece of evidence about the show's relationship to real-world events. This was new territory in 2013, but it has become increasingly familiar since. The conditions that produced the Turban Cowboy conspiracy theory, clip culture, viral spread, the architecture of social media platforms designed to maximize engagement rather than accuracy, have intensified rather than abated in the years since. Every episode of Family Guy now exists in two forms simultaneously: the version that aired, with its context and its framing, and the version that lives online as individual clips that can be extracted, recombined, and shared with whatever framing the person sharing them chooses to apply. For the show's defenders, this is a persistent frustration. Gags that work as part of a larger comic sequence, gags that are clearly absurdist and self-aware in their original context, can look very different when isolated and shared on social media with an outrage framing. The show's more provocative material, the racial humor, the disability jokes, the transgender storylines was often designed with a specific comic logic that depends on the audience understanding the show's relationship to its own transgression. Family Guy is, in many of its most controversial moments, making fun of the kind of person who would make the kind of joke it is appearing to make. That meta layer, the ironic distance between the show and its content, is extremely difficult to preserve when the clip is 6 seconds long and the framing is a tweet that says, "Can you believe this aired on TV?" For the show's critics, this frustration misses the point. The argument that a joke requires its original context to be properly understood is also an argument that the joke is accessible only to the audience that already shares its assumptions. If the joke's harmlessness depends on knowing that the show is being ironic, then the joke is doing something different to the audience member who doesn't catch the irony than it is doing to the audience member who does. And in a world where clips circulate without context, the irony-missing viewer is not the exception, they are often the majority. This is a genuine tension, and it is not one that Family Guy invented. But the show's clip-friendly structure has made it an unusually clear case study in how that tension plays out in practice. No other comedy has generated so many widely circulating moments that function differently in context than out of it. The result is a show that exists simultaneously as a beloved cultural institution for its fans and as a catalog of offensive content for its critics, and both groups are, in a narrow sense, responding accurately to the material they have encountered. The fandom itself has evolved in ways that reflect these broader shifts in how television is consumed. In the early 2000s, Family Guy's fan community was primarily organized around the standard fan sites and forums of that internet-era places where people discussed episodes, shared favorite moments, and argued about character development. That community was not small, but it was relatively bounded. The barriers to participation were mild. You had to seek out the forum, register, contribute, and the resulting culture tended to reward genuine engagement with the show rather than simply familiarity with its most viral moments. The explosion of social media and clip-sharing platforms changed that calculus entirely. Family Guy fandom in the 2020s is, to a significant degree, organized around the show's memetic content rather than the show itself. Many of the people who share Family Guy memes have not watched an episode in years or have never watched one in full. They know the show through its most circulated moments, the cutaway gags that became reaction images, the scenes that became Twitter shorthand, the clips that get shared whenever a real-world event resembles something that happened in Quahog. This is a form of cultural presence that goes well beyond what traditional television ratings can measure, and it has sustained Family Guy's relevance in periods when its actual viewership has been declining. The controversy engine, in this context, never really turns off. Older episodes continue to surface as new generations of internet users encounter them for the first time. A clip from a 2007 episode can become a controversy in 2022 when someone who never saw the original broadcast finds it and shares it with modern framing. The show's archive is not a fixed record of past decisions, it is a living repository of content that continues to generate reactions as it encounters audiences with different contexts and sensibilities than those the original. writers were addressing. This has created a specific kind of exhaustion among the people who work on the show. Writers and producers who have been with Family Guy for a decade or more have described the experience of watching old work resurface and be judged by standards that didn't exist when it was made. In some cases, they agree with the updated assessment the show has made genuine revisions to some of its older approaches, as evidenced by the casting changes and the evolution of certain recurring characters. In other cases, they feel that the updated assessment misunderstands what the work was trying to do. Both reactions are authentic, and neither fully resolves the underlying question of what a show owes the cultural moment in which it is consumed versus the cultural moment in which it was made. The internet age has also changed the nature of the backlash itself. The Parents Television Council's letter-writing campaigns of the early 2000s were, by the standards of what came later, almost quaint. They were organized, they were slow, and they had a clear target, the FCC complaint process, that gave them a defined form and a defined endpoint. The FCC either acted or it didn't. The complaint either went somewhere or it didn't. The controversy had a shape. Modern backlash is shapeless. It begins on social media, often within minutes of an episode airing. It spreads through shares and quote tweets and reaction videos, accumulating heat and attention that has no formal channel to direct itself toward. It doesn't file complaints with a regulatory body. It pressures advertisers, generates trending topics, draws in commentators who may never have watched the show, and subsides not when a formal decision is made but when the algorithm's attention moves elsewhere. The result is controversies that feel more intense than the PTC campaigns ever did, but that also resolve or fail to resolve without any of the clarity that a formal regulatory process provides. For Family Guy, which has spent its entire existence navigating controversy, this shift has required adaptation. The show has become more careful in some respects, the casting decisions, the evolution of certain character portrayals, and more deliberately provocative in others, leaning into its reputation as a show that doesn't bend to criticism as a kind of brand identity. Whether that identity is sustainable in the long term is a question the show's current writers are presumably asking themselves with some regularity. What is certain is that the show's relationship with controversy has become self-perpetuating in ways that were not true in its early years. Family Guy is now a show that people expect to be controversial. Critics watch it looking for things to criticize. Defenders watch it looking for things to defend. The culture around the show has become, in some ways, more interesting than the show itself. An ongoing argument about what comedy is for, who it serves, what it costs, and whether those costs are worth paying. That argument will not be settled tonight. It will not be settled by the time you fall asleep, or the time you wake up, or the time the show eventually ends its run, whenever that comes. It is the kind of argument that keeps going because the questions underneath it are genuinely hard, and the people on both sides are, in many cases, genuinely right about different parts of the same large and complicated thing. But for now, let the argument rest. Let the controversies soften into history, the way all controversies eventually do. The show ran. The gags landed. The complaints were filed. The episodes aired or didn't air. And somewhere in all of that noise and the 188,000 FCC complaints, and the canceled air dates, and the cut gags and the Twitter pile-ons, a strange, contradictory, often brilliant, often maddening piece of American television kept finding its audience, kept pushing its limits, kept making the kind of comedy that some people found liberating and others found unbearable, and kept going. That is not nothing. In the long, slow accounting of what television has been and what it has meant, that is not nothing at all. And now, it is time to rest. The Griffins will still be in Quahog when you wake up. The controversies will still be there, cataloged and argued over and occasionally updated with new footnotes from new episodes. None of it will have changed while you slept. Close your eyes. Let the room go quiet around you. The night is long and the sleep is close, and everything you needed to think about has been thought about enough for now. Wherever you are in the world, whatever hour it is where you are, good night. Sleep well. Thank you for being here. Section 23. The long exhale on staying with a show that won't behave. There is a particular kind of loyalty that long-running television inspires, and it is not the clean, uncomplicated loyalty of someone who simply loves a thing and never questions it. It is something more like the loyalty of a person who has stayed with something through the parts that disappointed them, the parts that made them uncomfortable, the parts where they looked at the screen and said, out loud or only to themselves, "That's not right," and kept watching anyway. Family Guy inspires that kind of loyalty in a way that few other shows have managed, and understanding why requires sitting with a question that the show's most heated controversies have always obscured. What does it mean to keep watching something you're not entirely sure you should love? This is not a question with a clean answer. It is the kind of question that lives in the space between what we enjoy and what we endorse, between the laugh that escapes before we've had time to decide whether it should and the discomfort that follows it. Family Guy has always lived in that space deliberately, provocatively, sometimes brilliantly, sometimes carelessly. The show has never made it easy to be a fan. It has never offered the satisfaction of a text that is entirely defensible, entirely coherent, entirely safe to recommend without a qualifier. And yet, the fans stayed. Season after season, cancellation and revival, FCC complaint and advertiser boycott, GLAAD statement and PTC campaign and Twitter pylon, the fans stayed. Part of what kept them was the humor itself, which at its best is genuinely unlike anything else on television: rapid, strange, densely referential, willing to follow a joke into territory that most comedy avoids because the territory is uncomfortable, or because the destination is unpredictable, or because no one is sure whether what's at the end of it is actually funny until they get there. The cutaway format that critics have long dismissed as lazy is, at its best, an extraordinarily flexible comic structure that allows the show to go anywhere and mean anything. The gag about Conway Twitty, the extended chicken fights, the recurring bits that have built up their own internal logic over 2 decades of episodes. These are not accidents of a careless creative process. They are the output of writers who understand comedy at a structural level and are willing to follow their instincts wherever they lead. Part of what kept the fans was also something harder to articulate: the sense that the show was honest, in its own anarchic way, about things that more respectable television was not. Not always right, not always wise, but honest. The Griffins are a family that does not really like each other very much, that holds together through inertia and occasional warmth, rather than the demonstrative affection of the idealized TV family. The world of Quahog is a world in which the stupid and the venal and the self-interested routinely win, in which good intentions produce bad outcomes, in which the gap between what people say and what they do is permanent and unbridgeable. That is not a comfortable vision, but it is a recognizable one, and recognition is its own form of comfort, even when what is being recognized is unpleasant. The show's relationship with its own controversial history has been, in recent years, something between acknowledgement and deflection. Seth MacFarlane has given interviews in which he expressed regret about specific choices: the Meg treatment, the Cleveland voice casting, while defending the broader project of transgressive comedy. The writers have occasionally addressed their own past work in the episodes themselves, with varying degrees of self-awareness. The show has changed, slowly and incrementally, in ways that reflect a genuine evolution of sensibility, and has also, in the same period, continued to produce material that generates the same objections it has always generated. This is not hypocrisy, exactly. It is the authentic complexity of a creative project that has been running for more than 25 years, that has employed hundreds of writers, that exists in a cultural landscape that has shifted dramatically since its first episode aired in 1999. The show that exists today is not the show that Seth MacFarlane pitched to Fox in the late 1990s. It is also recognizably the same show, the same characters, the same structure, the same fundamental relationship with its own irreverence. The controversies of its past and the controversies of its present are connected not just by brand recognition, but by something deeper: a consistent willingness to go to the places that other shows won't go, to say the things that other shows won't say, and to accept the consequences of that willingness even when those consequences are painful. Whether that willingness has produced more good than harm is a question that the show's admirers and critics will continue to argue about, and should continue to argue about, because the argument is worth having. Comedy that pushes against social norms is doing something important and risky simultaneously, And the two dimensions of that, the importance and the risk, deserve to be taken seriously by everyone who engages with the show, whether in appreciation or in anger. But right now, in this moment, none of that is what matters. What matters is that the night has gotten quieter, and your breathing has slowed, and the long catalog of controversies and canceled episodes and 188,000 complaints has settled into the background like a story told by a comfortable voice in a comfortable room. The story is finished. The Griffins are where you left them. The show is still on the air, and you can rest now. Whatever the next controversy turns out to be, whatever the next episode provokes, whatever argument the internet decides to have about a 20-year-old cutaway gag, none of it needs your attention tonight. None of it is yours to solve. The credits have rolled. The room is dark and still. The only sound is the quiet, the good quiet, the kind that comes after a long story has finally reached its end. Good night. Sleep deeply. You've earned it. A final note on comedy and the dark. Before we fully let go of this story, there is one more thing worth saying, something quieter than the controversies, something that sits beneath all of it. Comedy has always been a way of saying the things that cannot be said any other way. The court jester who told the king the truth while pretending to joke, the satirist who revealed the cruelty of power by making it ridiculous, the comedian who stood on a stage and said, out loud, the thing that everyone in the room was thinking but no one had the nerve to say plainly. This is not a new idea, but it is one that gets lost in arguments about specific jokes, specific episodes, specific tweets from specific writers who should have known better, or might have known better, or maybe did know better and said it anyway. Family Guy has never been a court jester in the elevated literary sense. It is too crude for that framing, too willing to go for the cheap laugh when the cheap laugh is available, too honest about its own commercial motivations to claim the pure tradition of the satirical truth-teller. Seth MacFarlane has always known he was making entertainment, not art with a capital A, and the show reflects that self-knowledge in ways both admirable and limiting. But at its best in the Holocaust episode, in the abortion episode that never aired, in the domestic violence story that landed imperfectly but tried something real, in the moments where the irreverence peeled back to reveal something genuine about how Americans live, and what they believe, and what they can't quite say in polite company at its best, the show touched that older tradition. It was doing something that comedy does when it is working. It was creating a space where difficult things could be held up to the light. That space was not always safe. It was not always used responsibly. It generated complaints and hurt feelings and genuine harm alongside the genuine insight. That is the cost of the kind of comedy that goes to the edges of what is acceptable and sometimes past them. The question is not whether the cost was worth it. That question has no universal answer. The question is whether the attempt was honest, whether the people making the show were, even in their failures, genuinely trying to do something more than shock or offend, whether the long, strange, contested, celebrated, criticized, canceled, revived run of Family Guy amounts to something that the culture is better for having had, or at least more honest about itself. The jury, in the fullest sense, is still deliberating. It will probably always be deliberating. That is the nature of comedy that matters. It keeps generating new verdicts. For now, though, the deliberation pauses. The night does its quiet work. The arguments of the day soften into the particular kind of peace that comes only after you have thought about something long enough to let it go, at least until morning. You are here, the story has been told. And wherever you are in the world, whatever city, whatever time zone, whatever small dark room you have found a rest in, you are allowed to stop thinking about Family Guy controversies now. The world will still be arguing about them when you wake up. It always is. But that is tomorrow's task. Tonight is only for sleep. Good night.